Before I get into the details of how to create and manipulate pivot tables, I'd like to demonstrate a few of the ways pivot tables help you analyze your worksheet data. When you look at a pivot table, it looks a lot like a regular worksheet with rows and columns of data, labels, subtotals, and grand totals. The difference is that a pivot table allows you to rearrange your data dynamically within the worksheet. If you click a cell inside of a pivot table, then you will see that Excel displays the options and design tabs on the ribbon. These contextual tabs allow you to manipulate your pivot table either by changing its style, which you can do on the design tab, or on the options tab, refreshing its data, changing its data source, and so on. What's really exciting about pivot tables is that you can change the structure of your data to emphasize different aspects of that data. Pivot tables are divided into several different areas. First, you have the pivot table field list, which allows you to manipulate the pivot table. And within the field list, you have the number of fields, which are data types that you can use. So you have the year, in this case the quarter, which is not displayed, month, company name, and revenue. And you can see those fields reflected in the body of the report. You change the arrangement of the fields within your pivot table using the field area, which is down here at the bottom of the pivot table field list task pane. So for example, you can have your company data as the column labels, and you can see that reflected here in the body of the pivot table with firm A and firm B. Then the row labels would be the year, in this case 2009, and then the month, starting with January and going down through December. If you want to change the pivot table's layout, you can do that by dragging a field name from one area to another. So for example, let's say that you wanted to lay out your data so that it was company, year, and month. And each of the company, year, and month labels were in the row area. To make that pivot, you would drag the company field name to the top of the row labels area, and then when you release the mouse button, the pivot table updates the data to reflect your new organization. So now, we have all the results for firm A in 2009 by month. And then, below the year 2009, we go to 2010, and again by month. And lower down in the pivot table, you'll see the same result for firm B. So I will scroll down using my mouse wheel, and below the grand total for firm A, you see the same data for firm B. You can also filter the data in your pivot table to focus your analysis. So let's say, for example, as I scroll back up to the top, that I wanted only to display the data for firm B. To create a filter, I can go into the pivot table field list, and then click the company fields down arrow, and then create the filter. In this case, I only want to show the data for firm B, so I will clear the checkbox next to firm A, and then click OK. When I do, Excel updates the pivot table so that only the data for firm B is displayed. If I want to clear that filter, then I can go into the pivot table field list, click the company fields bar, and then click Clear Filter from Company. When I do, Excel restores the data. You can also change the look of your pivot table. You can do that by adding or changing a style. So for example, if I click the Design tab, I can select any one of the available pivot table styles. So if I click the More button in the gallery, then I can click any of the available styles, and I will go down and I'll click one that's a bit darker for contrast. I hope this brief demonstration has given you a feel for pivot tables' capabilities. In the remaining movies in this course, I'll go into much more detail on how to create and manipulate pivot tables and the data they contain. Pivot tables enable you to summarize and reorganize your data dynamically, but you can't summarize just any data set. In most cases, your data needs to be laid out as a data list. So then the question becomes, what do I mean by a data list? In this case, a data list is something that you might think of as a table with distinct columns of data, and each one of those columns having a header. In this data list, my column headers are year, quarter, month, company, and revenue. And then within the list, we have a series of rows, each of which contains a value for each of those headers. In the first row, for example, we have the year 2009, quarter 1, month of January. The company is firm A, and then we have the revenue for that month. To be able to use the data inside of a pivot table, you need to make sure there are no blank rows. So if I scroll down in this list, you'll see that from A1 to E49 that there are no blank rows. it's okay to have blank cells. They'll just be included in the pivot table as blanks, rather than leave your data as a data list. In Excel 2007 and now in Excel 2010, you can create what are called Excel tables. And Excel tables allow you to do a lot more with your data than you could with just a normal data list. To create an Excel table, click any cell in your data list. And then on the Home tab of the ribbon in the Styles group, click Format as Table, and then select a format for your table. In this case, I'll just use the simple black and white style. Then in the Format as Table dialog box, verify that Excel has correctly identified where the data for your table resides. In this case, it is A1 through E49, and then Excel has detected that your table has headers. Those are the year, quarter, month, company, and revenue values in A1 through E1. So everything looks correct, and I can click OK. Excel tables are the best source for pivot table data because Excel refers to the table as a whole, regardless of how many rows it contains, and not just a specific group of cells that you might have to change later. I'll cover the differences between Excel tables and data list as sources in the movie entitled Updating and Refreshing Pivot Table Data Sources, which you can find later in this chapter. If you do use a data source that's not an Excel table, make sure that the column headers are formatted differently than the data. In the data list that I used here to create this table, the values year, quarter, month, company, and revenue were all centered and displayed in bold text. While we're here, I'd like to show you a few Excel table features. Those are the total row and filtering. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to filter this table so that it only displayed results for the month of January. To do that, you click the Month Columns Filter arrow, and then select the values that you want to display. In this case, I want to display just results for the month of January. So to do that, I will clear the Select All checkbox, which clears all of the checkboxes, meaning no values would be displayed if I were to apply this filter. Then I'll scroll down, check the box for January, and click OK. When I do, the table displays only the values for January. To remove the filter, I can click the filter arrow again and click Clear Filter from Month. You can also add what's called a total row. If I scroll down to the bottom of the table, and I'll do that using my mouse's scroll wheel, you'll see that the data just ends in row 49. However, if I add a total row, and to do that, I click any cell in the table, and then on the Table Tools Design tab on the ribbon, check the Total Row box. When I do, Excel adds a total row to the table, and the value here, 3683, is the total of all the values in the revenue column. And if you want to use a different summary operation, you can click any cell that contains a total, click the down arrow that appears, and you can select any one of these other functions. So for example, if I wanted to change the summary to average, then Excel will create a new formula, finding the average of all the values in that column. Once you have your source data arranged in a data list, you can create a pivot table. There is one other case, which I will cover in the movie entitled Consolidating Data from Multiple Sources, which you can find later in this chapter. Pivot tables are powerful and flexible Excel analysis tools. A pivot table lets you arrange, sort, and filter a dataset on the fly, so you can analyze it from several different perspectives with a minimum of effort. In this movie, I'll show you how to create a pivot table from a data list that's stored in the same workbook. To begin, you need to have a data list, such as the Excel table I have here. We have 5 columns, year, quarter, month, company, and revenue, and each of the rows inside of this Excel table contains a value for each one of those columns. To create the pivot table, click the Insert tab on the ribbon, and then click the Pivot Table button. When you do, Excel displays the Create Pivot Table dialog box. First, you should verify that Excel has identified your data correctly, and in this case it's Table 1, and you can see the marquee outline around that selection inside of the workbook, so we know everything's right. And then you need to decide where you want the pivot table report to be placed. I always place my reports on a new worksheet, and you can see that the new worksheet option has been selected by default because that's the most common choice. However, if you did want to create your pivot table on an existing worksheet, say for example, starting at cell G2 on this worksheet, then you can select the existing worksheet option, and then click the Collapse dialog box button. and I want to click cell G2 as my target, and then click the Expand dialog box button, and you see that location is identified within the Create Pivot Table dialog box. So that's how you do it if you want to create on an existing worksheet. I'll go back to my original choice of creating on a new worksheet to avoid crowding, and then click OK. When I do, Excel creates a new worksheet and displays a blank pivot table and also displays the pivot table field list. If for any reason you don't see the pivot table field list task pane over here on the right, then you can click any cell inside the pivot table, and then on the Options contextual tab on the ribbon, you can click the field list button. So clicking the field list button while the field list is displayed will hide it, and clicking the button while the field list is hidden will display it. Now you can move your data into place to create the pivot table. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to have my years as my column labels. So in other words, along the top of the pivot table, I will have the years, in this case 2009 and 2010, and then I will have the company field provide the values for the row labels. So I can drag the company field header down to the row labels area. And now I have 2009, 2010, firm A and firm B. Now I can add the revenue field to the values area, and that provides the values for the body of the pivot table. If I want to add another field to the report, then I can do that. So let's say, for example, that I want to add month below company in the row labels area. So now my pivot table has data for firm A and then each month. And then along the columns, we have 2009 and 2010. And then we have firm B with the data laid out exactly the same way. I always make one change to the default pivot table layout. When Excel creates a pivot table, it puts the subtotals for each first level grouping at the top of the group. So for example here, you have firm A, and then in 2009, the total was 963. In 2010, it was 961 with a grand total of 1924. I personally prefer the subtotal positions to be at the bottom of the group. To make that change, click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the Subtotals button, and then click Show All Subtotals at Bottom of Group. It's simply a matter of personal preference, but I like two things about this. First, I like to see the individual values before I see the total. And secondly, I like that Excel puts a blank row beside the name Firm B instead of having all of the data run together. So to me, visually, this is a little easier to understand. Now that you've learned how to create a pivot table, you can move forward and discover how to rearrange your data dynamically. Excel lets you summarize your data quickly, but the real power of a pivot table comes when you want to rearrange your data dynamically. A task that would take several minutes if done by hand takes just a few seconds when you summarize your data in a pivot table. The row headers and column headers provide the basic structure for your pivot table. In this case, my rows are the months, January through December, and the columns are the two companies, Firm A and Firm B, for which I have data. If I wanted to, I could change my data layout so that the companies provided the headers for the rows, and the months provided the values for the column labels. To do that, I can go into the Pivot Table Field List task pane, and then in the lower part of the field list. I can change the position of the labels by dragging them from one area to another. So for example, I can drag company to the row labels area and month to the column labels area. As I desired, the companies provide the values for the rows, and the months provide the values for the columns. If I want to divide my data up a little bit more to provide more detail as opposed to the summary that I have right now, then I can add second rows or column headers to create those subdivisions. So for example, let's return the pivot table to its original position where I have month in the row area and company in the column area. Let's say that I want to divide my months into quarters. To do that, I would drag the quarter field down to the top of the row labels area, and you can see a thin bluish gray line that appears just above the month header here in the row labels area. If I were to drag quarter below month, then the line appears below it indicating its position, but I'll put quarter above month, and when I release the left mouse button, then you see that the data is arranged first by quarter and then by month. If I were to reverse the order of those two labels by putting quarter below month, Then we would have January, which belongs in quarter one, February, which belongs in quarter one, and so on. That arrangement doesn't make much sense, so I'll put it back and have the months arranged by quarter for January, February, March, quarter one, April, May, June, quarter two, and so on. If I want, I can add another layer. In this case, I'll use the year field and I will put it above quarter in the row labels area. And again, you can see the line when it will be dropped. So here we have quarter one for 2009, quarter two, and so on. And if I use my mouse scroll wheel to move down, we'll see the same data for 2010. There's one other thing about pivoting a pivot table that I'd like to show you, and that is how to defer the layout updates when you're pivoting. So let's say that you have an extremely large data set. It could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of rows, or they could be a data set that you're connecting to over a network and the network connection might be slow for some reason. If that's the case, then you can do what's called deferring the layout update. To do that, at the bottom of the pivot table field list, check the Defer Layout Update box, and then make your changes. So let's say, for example, that I want to take out month, and then also take out quarter. Now you notice that the pivot table hasn't changed to reflect my update. When I'm ready, and I've made all the changes I want to make, click the Update button, and Excel updates the pivot table, and I will drag the scroll bar up so that you can see the pivot table in its new state, which is year providing the value for the row labels and company providing the value for the column labels. Changing a pivot table's arrangement shifts the data's emphasis, which enables you to examine the data from different perspectives quickly and easily. When you create a pivot table in Excel, Excel shows a number of pivot table elements by default. You can show, hide, or in some cases move these elements to change the pivot table configuration to your liking. For example, one element of a pivot table that's associated with the ribbon are the Options and Design contextual tabs. If you want to hide those contextual tabs, you can click any cell outside of the pivot table, and when you do, Excel takes those tabs off the ribbon. If you want to bring them back, just click any cell in the pivot table, and the contextual tabs reappear. You can also show or hide the pivot table field list task pane. So let's say, for example, that you have arranged your pivot table so that it's fairly wide. So let's say that I have company in the row labels area, and then I have year, and then month in the column labels area. And that means that my pivot table is too wide to fit on the screen. If I want to hide the pivot table field list to allow more of the data to appear on the screen, then I can go into the pivot table field list and click the Close button to close it and display most of the data. And if I want to display all of it, then I can just change my zoom level. To do that, you go to the View Shortcuts toolbar at the bottom right corner of the program window and click the Zoom Out button. So just click it a couple of times, and now all of your data appears on the worksheet. Now, if you want to bring the field list task pane back, you can go up to the Options contextual tab and click the Field List button. And now you can pivot your pivot table back into its original configuration. So we'll move month to the bottom of the rows area, year above it, and company over to the side, and then increase our zoom level back to 130% by clicking 5 times. If you want, you can also show and hide the Expand and Contract buttons, which are here to the left of each of the row labels. So here I have the year 2009, and if I want to collapse all 2009, in other words, not display it within the worksheet, then I can click the Collapse button, which looks like a minus sign, and collapse that data. If I want to expand it back out, you'll notice that the button has changed to look like a plus sign. Now it's an Expand button, so I can click it and display all the data under 2009. If you want to get rid of the Expand and Contract buttons entirely, then on the Options contextual tab, you can click the Expand and Contract or the plus minus buttons button, and when you do, Excel hides them. If you want to bring them back, just click the button again, and they'll reappear. If you want, you can also hide the field headers, which are the values row labels and column labels. Those are currently in cells B3 and A4. If you want to hide that text, on the Options tab, you can click the Field Headers button, and now there's a little more room inside of your pivot table outline. If you want to bring those values back, you can just click the Field Headers button again, and they reappear. The pivot table field list task pane The expand and contract buttons and field headers are all useful pivot table components, but you don't have to use them. If you want to remove them from your pivot table's current view, you can do so by using the controls on the Options contextual tab on the ribbon. Excel enables you to build pivot tables from data found both inside and outside the workbook where you create the pivot table. If you want to create a pivot table from a data source you either can't or don't want to import into Excel directly, you can create a connection to that data source and work with it in place. So let's say that you want to create a pivot table using data from another Excel workbook. To do that, you go to the Insert tab and click the Pivot Table button. Then in the Create Pivot Table dialog box, you select the Use an External Data Source option, and then click Choose Connection. Then in the Existing Connections dialog box, if the connection or the data source that you want already appears, then you can click it and then click Open. In this case, I haven't created any connections yet, so I will click the Browse for More button. And this displays a version of the Open dialog box. In this case, it's named Select Data Source. The data that I want is in my Exercise Files folder, and that is on my desktop. And it's in Exercise Files, Chapter 1. And the file that I'm using for this exercise is called Outside Source. So I can click that file and then click Open. Then the Select Table dialog box appears, and the Select Table dialog box shows you the different data sources that you can use within that target data source to create your pivot table. In this case, there's only one, and that is named as Sheet 2. So it is selected. You can see it's highlighted here in blue. And then I happen to know from working with this data before that the first row of the data does in fact contain column headers. So I can leave that box selected, and then I can click OK. And Excel accepts that choice and sends me back to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now I want to create the pivot table on an existing worksheet. So in this case, I have Sheet 1, cell A1, which is selected here. And when I'm ready, I can click OK. After I click OK, Excel creates the pivot table on Sheet 1. And now I can create the pivot table as I would normally. So let's say, for example, that I want to have my company field in the column labels area, and then the year and quarter in the row labels area, and then the revenue in the values area. And it's a pivot table just like any other pivot table. You can pivot it, filter it, add styles to it, and so on. One important thing to note is that if you use an Excel workbook as your data source, you can't open that workbook while the workbook that contains the pivot table is open. So in other words, if I display my exercise files folder and I double-click Outside Source to try to open it, then Excel displays an error dialog box indicating that the file is in use and that it can't open it. In this case, the error is that the file format or file extension is not valid, but that's not the real error. In this case, the file is just in use by another file. So we can click OK to close that dialog box. And now, if I close the external workbook, and I'll do that by pressing Ctrl W, and I will not save my work, and then go back to my exercise files folder, if I double-click Outside Source, then the file opens normally. If possible, you should always draw the data for a pivot table from the original source so that any changes to that source are reflected in the pivot table that you use to analyze your data. If you run a small business, you might maintain important business data in an Access database. If you do, you can create a pivot table based on the original database table instead of importing the data into Excel. In this movie, I'll show you how to do just that. To create the pivot table, first you click the Insert tab on the ribbon, and then click the Pivot Table button. Then, in the Create Pivot Table dialog box, select the Use an External Data Source option, and then click Choose Connection. The connection we want doesn't appear in the existing connections list, so we'll click Browse for More, and then navigate to my Exercise Files folder, which is on my desktop, in the Exercise Files folder, and in Chapter 1. And the database that I want to use is called PT Database, so I'll click it, and click Open. Now we can create the pivot table report on an existing worksheet. And right now the location is Sheet 1, cell A1, and that is the highlighted cell here. That's fine. So we can click OK and create a link to that data and create a pivot table based on that data. And now I can create the pivot table as I would normally. So in this case, I will have company providing the values for the row labels area, and then we'll put quarter over in the column labels area, and then we'll fill in the values or the sum of the sales for each company for each of those quarters in the values area. Creating a pivot table by connecting to an Access database table saves you the trouble of importing the data into your workbook. However, you must be able to connect to the database either as a file on the same computer or over a network for your pivot table to have the most current data. If you think maintaining your connection to the database will be an issue, then you should import the data into Excel and create your pivot table from that imported data. I should also point out that the techniques I showed you in this movie also let you connect to an online analytical processing or OLAP cube, such as those created by SQL Server Analysis Services. Most of the time, you'll create a pivot table from a data list or Excel table, but you can also summarize multiple data ranges using a pivot table if the data is formatted appropriately. To consolidate a series of data ranges into a pivot table, the ranges must be laid out in cross-tabular format and have exactly the same structures. In the sample file here, I have 3 worksheets: support calls, order calls, and return calls. And the data on the support calls worksheet has a series of distribution regions north, south, east, and west along the row label area, and then the years 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010 along the top, or providing the values for the column labels. And then here in cell B3, you'll see that I have region-year. Now normally, if you were to create a cross-tabular table like this, you would put region in cell B3 and year in cell C2. The reason you don't do that in this case is because this region that contains the data and all of the labels must be perfectly rectangular. In other words, there must be data in each one of those cells. So if I were to have region in cell B3 and year in cell C2, then this cell would be blank, as would cells D2 through F2. And the data layout would not be perfectly rectangular. So the technique I'm about to show you would not work. And the data I have on my other worksheets, order calls, has the same layout, and return calls has the same layout as well. So now I'll switch back to the first worksheet, support calls, and continue on. If you want to create a pivot table using this data, you need to do something a little bit different than you would when you create a pivot table from a data list or an Excel table. To run the pivot table and pivot chart wizard, you need to hold down the Alt key, press D, and then press P. When you do, you launch the pivot table and pivot chart wizard. On the first page of the wizard, select the Multiple Consolidation Ranges option, and then click Next. Then on the second page, select the I will create the page fields option, and click Next. And now on the next page, you can select the worksheet ranges that you want to consolidate. To start with the cursor flashing in the range box, click the Collapse dialog box button, and then on the first worksheet, select the cells that contain the data. So we have B3 through F7. Click the Expand dialog box button, and then click Add. And now we do the same for the other worksheets. So click the Collapse dialog box button again, change to the Order Calls worksheet by clicking its Sheet tab, and then select B3 through F7. Expand dialog, click Add to add that range to the list of ranges, and then finally click the Collapse dialog box button again, click Return Calls, select that data, expand the dialog, and click Add. In this case, we don't want any page fields, which are also called report filter fields, so we'll leave that option selected to 0, and then click Next. On the final page of the wizard, verify that the New Worksheet option is selected and click Finish. When we do, that the data appears in the new pivot table. Now notice over here in the pivot table field list that the fields have the names row, column, and value. Value's okay, but I'd like to change the other two. To do that, I click any cell in the pivot table with a value for the field that I want. In this case, we have North, and that is part of the row group. If I want to change the name of the active field, then on the Options Contextual tab, in the Active Field group, select the name in the Active Field box, and change the name. In this case, I'll change it to region, REGION, and press enter. And you'll notice that the name of the field changed over in the pivot table field list. And now I can do the same for year. I'll click any cell that contains a year value, and then on the Options tab in the Active Field box, I can type year, press enter, and the change takes place. You probably won't create many pivot tables by consolidating multiple data ranges, but it's nice to know the capability is available if you're working with legacy workbooks that have their data laid out in cross-tabular formats. Companies generate new sales, budget, and operations data all the time, so pivot table data sources rarely remain static. In this movie, I'll show you how to manage your data connection to ensure your pivot table contains the most recent data available. You can display your pivot table's data connection by clicking any cell in the pivot table, as I've done here, and then on the Options Contextual tab, click the Change Data Source button. When you do, the Change Pivot Table Data Source dialog box appears, and in this case, you can see that this pivot table draws its data from a table with the name of firm data. If you want to change the data source, you can select a new data source within the workbook, but notice that the Use an External Data Source option is grayed out. The reason that's the case is because you can change a data source to another one of the same kind. That is, you can swap one internal data source for another, or one external data source for another, but you can't chain from one type of connection to another. If you want to use external data for a pivot table, when you've already created it using internal data, then you will need to create a new pivot table instead of editing the current one. Now let's go back to the pivot table that I displayed earlier, so I'll click Cancel. This pivot table draws its data from an Excel table, and one of the major benefits of using an Excel table as your data source is that when you add a row to the table and refresh the data connection, the new data appears in the pivot table automatically. So the data for this pivot table is on the Table Data worksheet, and if I scroll down using my scroll wheel to the last row, then I can add another row to the table and have that data appear in the pivot table. So let's say that I click this last cell and press Tab to add a new row to the table, and then we'll put in data from 2011, so it'll be 2011, quarter 1, month of January, for firm A, and then for revenue, we'll just make it 200, so it stands out from all the other data, and press Enter. Now, when I go back to the From Table worksheet, you don't see any change in the pivot table yet, and I'll scroll down to the bottom of 2010, so you can see the change when it occurs. Now there's new data in the table, so if I click the Options Contextual tab, and then click the Refresh button, the data that I just added to the Excel table appears in the pivot table automatically. By comparison, if you build your pivot table based on a data list as opposed to an Excel table, then that data does not appear when you refresh the connection. So I have another pivot table on the From List worksheet. It's exactly the same table based on the similar data. And this data is on the List Data worksheet. And you'll notice that this is simply a worksheet list. It hasn't been turned into an Excel table. If I use my scroll wheel to scroll down, and then in the next available row, type in the exact same data we had before, 2011, quarter 1, for January, firm A, and then revenue of 200, and press Enter. If I go back to the pivot table on the From List worksheet, and I'll scroll down using my scroll wheel again, and then on the Options Contextual tab, click Refresh, nothing happens. What I need to do is update the data source manually. So to do that, again on the Options tab, I can click the Change Data Source button, and then you'll see the definition here in the Table/Range box. I added another row, and that increments a number. So now, instead of having the table or range end on cell E49, it actually ends on cell E50. So I'll backspace over the 49, type in 50, click OK, and now you see that the pivot table updates reflect the new definition. Whenever I view a pivot table, I always click the Refresh button to include any updates to the data source. If you create pivot tables based on Excel tables, the new data will appear automatically when you refresh. However, if your pivot table draws its data from a data list, you should examine the source data list to identify any new rows and edit the data source to reflect the change. Pivot tables behave a bit differently than other Excel workbook elements, so you'll need to use a few slightly different techniques to select, move, copy, and delete them within your workbook. You can rename a pivot table by clicking any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Options contextual tab on the ribbon. In the pivot table group at the far left corner of the ribbon, you can type a new name for the pivot table. So in this case, I will call it Firm Revenue and press Enter. This name will help you and other users interpret formulas that draw on this pivot table's data. If you want to clear all the fields, filters, and formats from a pivot table, you can do so again on the Options contextual tab. Click the Clear button, and then click Clear All. Doing so doesn't delete the pivot table. Instead, what it does is remove all the fields from the row area, column area, report filter area, and the values area so that you can rebuild it from the ground up. I'll put my fields back. So we have year, month, company, and revenue. If you want to create a second pivot table from the same data range, you can do that by copying and pasting the pivot table. So again, with any pivot table cell selected, on the Options contextual tab, click the Select button, and then click Entire Pivot Table. Now press Ctrl+C to copy the pivot table, and then select where you want to paste it. In this case, I will go to the PT Paste worksheet. Cell A1 is selected, and when I'll press Ctrl+V, and when I do, Excel paste in the pivot table. Now the two pivot tables work off the same data, but they are independent of each other. So for example, if I were to take the month field out of the row labels area on this version of the pivot table, and then switch back to the original pivot table, which is on the PT worksheet, you'll see that this pivot table is still in its original configuration. And I'll press the Escape key to remove the selection marquee from around the pivot table. If you want to copy a particular pivot table arrangement to another worksheet, but instead of creating a new pivot table, do so as a data, then you can do that by selecting the entire pivot table. And again, you do that by clicking any cell in the pivot table. Then on the Options tab, click Select, Entire Pivot Table, and then press Ctrl+C. That copies the pivot table to the clipboard. Now go to another worksheet, and in this case, I will go to Data Paste, and then with cell A1 selected, on the Home tab, I'll click the Paste button's down arrow, and then click the first icon in the Paste Values row. When I do, Excel pastes in the contents of the pivot table, but this time, instead of creating a pivot table, it only pastes the data. If you want to delete a pivot table, which I could do by switching back to the PT Paste worksheet and then clicking any cell in this pivot table, I can delete the pivot table by clicking Options, then select Entire Pivot Table and pressing the Delete key. With these techniques in mind, you'll be able to manage your pivot tables effectively. Excel pivot tables display your data in as much or as little detail as you prefer. Pivoting and filtering the pivot table changes how the individual data elements are displayed. But you can also position the subtotals and grand totals for rows and columns to summarize your data as desired. For example, in this pivot table, I currently have both subtotals and grand totals turned on. So you'll see that for Firm A, the subtotal for the year 2009 was 963. For Firm B, the same subtotal for that year was 924, and we have a grand total for that year of 1887. And you'll see a subtotal for each of the firms and the grand total for 2010. And then at the bottom of the pivot table, which I displayed by scrolling down using my mouse's scroll wheel, you'll see that we have a grand total for Firm A of 1924, Firm B of 1729, and a grand total for both of 3683. Now I'd like to show you how to change how subtotals and grand totals are displayed. So I'll scroll back up so you can see my change more clearly. Now after clicking any cell inside the pivot table, I can go up to the Design Contextual tab on the ribbon, and then in the Layout group, click the Subtotals button, and then I can select the option that I want for subtotals. At present, I am showing all subtotals at the top of the group, so I will change it now to the bottom by clicking Show All Subtotals at Bottom of Group. And when I do, Excel simply moves the subtotal to the bottom of the group below the individual data lines. So I have the year, and then individual months and their totals. the grand total for both firms for a given month, and then the subtotals and grand totals as displayed here. If you want to turn off subtotals entirely, then you can click the subtotals button and click Do Not Show Subtotals. And putting subtotals at the top or bottom of the group is simply a matter of personal preference. Personally, I prefer to have subtotals at the bottom of the group because I like to see the individual data points and see what they add up to at the end. But if you prefer to see the total and then the details, perfectly fine, just select the option you want. Grand totals, on the other hand, summarize all of the values in a row or column. You can't reposition them, but you can turn them on or off for rows or columns or both. So let's say that I want to turn them off for rows. Just click any cell in the pivot table and then on the Design Contextual tab, click Grand Totals. And then I'm going to turn them on for columns only. In other words, turn them off for rows. So on for columns only, and you'll see that the grand totals appear at the bottom. Now if I scroll back up, and then click Grand Totals, and turn them on for rows only, then you'll see the grand totals for each of the rows. And then if you scroll down, you see that they've been turned off for columns. Or if you prefer, you can click the Grand Totals button and turn them off entirely. To bring them back, just click Grand Totals and then on for rows and columns. If you change the summary operation that a pivot table uses to display its data, then Excel applies that change to the subtotal and grand total fields. I'll show you how to do that in another movie later on in this chapter. Subtotals and grand totals provide easy-to-read summaries of the values in your pivot table's rows and columns. If you find those extra rows and columns are a distraction, or if you just want to emphasize the values in the body of your data area, you can hide them quite easily. Most of the data that you summarize using pivot tables will have some sort of financial or personnel aspect, such as sales or hours worked, which means that you'll usually want to find the sum of the values in the list. You're not limited to adding values together though. You can choose from several summary calculations and also have the ability to change the type of value shown in the data area. For example, you can express individual values as a percentage of the column or row total, or compare values to those of the previous year. If you want to change the summary calculation used in a pivot table, right-click any cell in the pivot table's data area. And that means any cell that contains an individual value. So for example, not a grand total or a subtotal, and not any of the labels either here in the columns or here for the rows. So instead, right-click any cell in the data area, point to Summarize Values By, and then select the operation that you want to use. In this case, I'll change it to Average. Now note that the values in the body of the data area didn't appear to change, and that's because each individual value is its own average. There's only one value for 2008 and the month of January, so the average will be 67. However, here in the grand total area, you'll see that the values have changed. So for example, let's look at March. We had the value of 128, and then add the value of 34, which is 162, and then add the value of 138 in cell D8. That's a total of 300. There are three values, the average of which is 100, which is displayed here in the grand total column. In addition to changing the summary operation, you can change how the values are displayed within the body of the pivot table. To do that, first I will switch the summary operation back to Sum, so I'll right-click a cell, point to Summarize Values By, and then click Sum. And now I'm going to change how the values are calculated. To do that, right-click any cell in the data area, and then point to Show Values As, and select the type of operation that you want to do. In this case, I want to compare the values in 2009 to those of 2008, and the values in 2010 to those in 2009. In other words, I want to compare each year to its previous year. Click Percentage of. Doing so displays a dialog box that you can use to set your base field and the base item. So in this case, I want the base field to be year, so I'm comparing year on year, and I want to compare each year to its previous year. And the base item is already selected as previous, so I can click OK, and Excel updates the pivot table with those calculations. So for example, the value from 2009 was 191% roughly of the same value for January 2008, and in 2010, that value was only 65% of the value from 2009. Now let's say that I want to compare 2009 and 2010 to 2008. To do that, I can right-click any cell in the data area, point to Show Values As, and then again click percentage of to display the dialog box. We're still comparing years, but now I can click the base item box's down arrow, and instead of clicking previous, I can click 2008, and when I click OK, the pivot table updates its calculations, and now 2009 and 2010 are both compared to the values for the same month from 2008. There's one other summary operation I'd like to show you, and that is creating a running total in each column. To do that, right-click any cell in the data area, point to Show Values As, and then click Running Total In. Then in the dialog box, you can select your base field, and in this case, I do want it to be month, and you can click OK. And the pivot table now contains the running total for each year by month. So for example, January of 2008 had a value of 67, and then at the end of February, we had a total of 136. So the value for February isn't 136, but the sum of all revenue for January and February is 136, and so on. Now notice that there is not a subtotal at the bottom of this group, and the reason is because the subtotal actually appears in December, because that is the running total of all 12 months in an individual year. You should take some time to experiment with the summary operations and settings available for use in the data area. You'll probably find one or more operations other than addition that provide meaningful information about your data. When most users visualize a pivot table, they see it with a single data set in the data area. While that's certainly the most common data area configuration, you can summarize more than one data field at a time. So let's say, for example, that I have a monthly revenue worksheet for 2 firms, and I already have the revenue field in the data area. So if you look in the pivot table field list, you can see the revenue field there, and then you can also see the same data in the body of the pivot table. Now let's say that I want to create a pivot table that displays the revenue data for each month, and I also want to show the same data but as a comparison. Say, for example, if I wanted to compare the values between firm A and firm B as a percentage. To do that, I can add a second copy of the revenue field to my data area. And to do that, click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the pivot table field list, drag the revenue field header down to the values area again. When I drag it down, even though the revenue field is already there, if I drag the revenue field header down to the values area and release, then Excel creates a second copy of the revenue field in that area. And you'll notice that the pivot table changes. I have sum of revenue, and then I have sum of revenue too. And then also in the column labels area, in the pivot table field list task pane, you'll see that I have a sigma values header. What that means is that for the column labels to create room for that second data set, it had to create a second values column. Having 2 copies of the same data summarized in the same way doesn't really help us. So what we need to do is change how 1 copy of that data is summarized. To do that, you can right-click any cell in either of the 2 data areas. So in this case, I have sum of revenue 2. I'll right-click a cell in one of those columns, point to Show Values As, and then I'll do percentage of, and then we'll make it a percentage of the previous month. So right now, our base field is month. That's correct. And then I will change the base item to previous, and then click OK. So the value in January is 100% because we are comparing it to itself. But then the value in each successive month is compared as a percentage to the value from the previous month. So for example, 69 is 102.99% of 67, 128 is 185.51% of 69, and so on. Now, you don't have to have 2 copies of the same field in your data area. So for example, if I were to remove the second sum of revenue field, dragging it back to the field area, I could also add another numerical value, such as, for example, the number of sales, and that data is in the sales column. So I'll drag it down to the values area. And now I have the revenue for each month, and then I also have the number of sales. So for example, I could now determine that I had $67,000 of revenue based on this number of sales. That information gives me a lot more insight into my sales performance, and also it allows me to perform other calculations that I'll show you how to do in a movie later on in this chapter. Pivot tables enable you to analyze your data efficiently, but some questions can only be answered by performing calculations on the data used to create your pivot table. To perform that type of analysis, you can create custom fields that summarize pivot table data using a formula. Without calculated fields, you would have to copy the data from your pivot table, paste it on another worksheet, and create the formulas there, and that's a pain. Now you have to dig a little to find the button you click to create a calculated field, but you can find it by clicking the Options Contextual tab on the ribbon, and then in the Calculations group, click Fields, Items, and Sets. And the item you want on this menu is Calculated Field. When you click Calculated Field, the Insert Calculated Field dialog box appears. Now you can type a name for your calculation, and in this case, I will call it Average Sale. And now I can create the formula. To create the formula, I will click in the formula box and backspace to delete the 0. And now I can insert fields and any mathematical operators that I want. So I want to find the average value of each sale. So I'm going to divide total revenue per month by the number of sales per month. So for that, I'll click the revenue field here in the fields list and click Insert Field, and then type a /, which means divide in Excel, and then I'll click Sales Count, Insert Field, and then click OK. When I do, Excel adds the average sale field to the body of the pivot table. Now, even though I don't know the number of sales for a given month, I know that in January, I had a total revenue of 67, and the average revenue per sale was 9.57 approximately. They should note that even though the newly calculated field appears here in the pivot table field list, it hasn't been added to the original data source. So for example, this pivot table was built off of data found on sheet 2 in this worksheet, and you'll see that the only data I have are for the year, quarter, month, company, revenue, and sales count. The new field, average sales, only exists within the pivot table's data cache, which is its temporary memory. So you can see that calculated fields extend the type of analysis you can perform in Excel, making pivot tables even more useful for your operational analyses. When you summarize your data using a pivot table, Excel organizes the data based on the order of the fields in the columns area and in the row area. You can then use the expand and collapse controls at each organizational level to hide the details for those rows. So for example, in this pivot table, the row area is arranged by company, year, and month. If I wanted to hide all of the details for the months within the year 2009, for example, then I could click the collapse control here beside 2009, and when I do, I just see the summary for 2009 as opposed to the individual months. If I click the expand control, then the details reappear. Now the months represent the lowest level of organization, so you can't hide them individually. As the pivot table stands now, you can only hide the monthly results by hiding every month for an entire year. But if you do want to show or hide groups of months, you can do so by creating a group. A group is a user-defined set of rows that you can expand or collapse as desired. To create a group, select one set of pivot table rows that contain the values you want to include in the group. So for example, let's say that I wanted to select February, March, and April. I'll move the mouse pointer, which you can see here, over the left edge of one of the row labels. When it changes to a right-pointing black arrow, then I know that it is in position to select rows. So I'll click the left mouse button and drag down, and I will select February through April. Now you'll notice that Excel is selecting February through April of 2009, and it was also selecting February through April of 2010. So regardless of which months you select, the selection would be the same for every year within the pivot table. Now, with those pivot table rows selected, go up to the Options Contextual tab, and then in the Group, click Group Selection. When you do, Excel creates a custom group for those months. If you want to hide the details of that group and just see a summary, then you can click the Collapse control beside the name Group 1 and hide those details. If you want to bring them back, you can click the Expand control to bring them back. Now, the name Group 1 isn't very descriptive. So if you want to edit that name, you can click the cell that contains the name Group 1 and then select the value on the formula bar and change it. So for example, it might be Sale Month. And press Enter. When you do, you change the value of the label. Now note that normally double-clicking a cell would allow you to edit the value within the cell, but in this case, double-clicking the cell that contains the label Sale Months would collapse the group, and double-clicking it again would expand it. If you want to remove a group from a pivot table, in other words, to ungroup the selection, you can click the header cell, and then on the Options Contextual tab, in the Group, click Ungroup. Grouping pivot table fields enables you to hide or display rows of data that belong together without creating a new field in your data source. Be sure to change the name of the group to something more descriptive than Group 1, and when you're done with your analysis, consider ungrouping the fields to make the pivot table's layout simpler. When you create a formula, it's usually a good idea to draw the formula's values from the original data source. That way, if the source changes, your formula's result will update the next time Excel recalculates your workbook. But what do you do if your pivot table contains data drawn from an outside source and you can't get at the original tables? In that case, you can refer to a cell within the pivot table using a Get Pivot Data formula. Let's say that you want to use the data in a pivot table cell in your formula. And for that, we'll make it the value in C6, which is the value for January 2009 for firm B. To create this formula, you start typing another formula such as sum. So click any cell outside the pivot table, and then type equal, and then the name of the function, sum, and then a left parentheses, and now you click the cell that you want to use the data from inside the pivot table. So in this case, I'll click cell C6. And you see that Excel creates a Get Pivot Data function, which has a bunch of information inside of it. This information refers to the cell that I just clicked inside the pivot table, and I'll walk you through step by step to show you what it's doing to identify that cell. The first thing it's doing is indicating the field that contains the value. That field name is revenue, and you can see that the sum of revenue field is what's summarized within the body of the pivot table, so that's the first part. The second part is the cell A3. A3 is the first cell at the top left corner of the pivot table. Year indicates the year field, and 2009 is the year that is applied to the cell in C6. So as you can see, the year is 2009, and the cell C6 clearly falls within that part of the pivot table. Next, the month is January, and you can see that here, it is in fact for January. And then finally, you have the company, which are the columns, and it is firm B. And cell C6 is under firm B, so it is that company's data. Now you can close out the formula by typing a right parentheses and then pressing enter. Normally, you wouldn't create such a simple formula as I have here. Instead, you'd use your Get Pivot Data function as part of a larger calculation, but I wanted to keep it simple just for demonstration purposes. So I'll click a cell in the pivot table to bring the pivot table field list back. When you pivot the pivot table, as long as the cell that contains the data you want still appears within the pivot table, then the formula won't change. So let's say that I put company below year and month in the row labels area. When I do that, even though the arrangement of the pivot table has changed, the value of the formula remains the same because the value is still displayed within the pivot table. And you can see that value here. It's currently in cell B7. And if I were to pivot the pivot table back by putting company back in the column labels area, the value goes back to C6 instead of B7, and the formula remains the same. Even though you can pivot your pivot table and have the formula retain its value, if you hide one of the fields that the Get Pivot Data formula uses to identify the proper cell within the pivot table, then the formula will generate an error. So let's say, for example, that instead of having company within the column labels or the row labels area, then I remove it from the pivot table. When I do, the formula in cell F1, which refers to the pivot table cell, generates a reference error, and that's because it no longer has the information that it needs to identify the proper cell within the pivot table. And also, the value for January 2009 for firm B no longer exists within this particular arrangement of the pivot table. You can see that all we have is the sum of revenue for both companies, and it's not broken out by individual company. If I drag the company field header back to the column labels area, then the formula gets restored to its proper order, and it can identify the cell it needs to return a value. Now, if you find that clicking a pivot table cell doesn't generate a Get Pivot Data formula, then it's possible you or someone else might have turned off the option that enables you to do that. To make sure you can use pivot table data in a formula, click the File tab, then click Options, and then on the Formulas tab of the Excel Options dialog box, Make sure that the Use Get Pivot Data Functions for Pivot Table References checkbox is selected. When it is, you can create your Get Pivot Data functions the way that I did in this movie. The Get Pivot Data function makes it easy to summarize pivot table data in your worksheets. If it's not practical to draw the data from the original source, you can always use the pivot table reference instead. One often overlooked aspect of pivot tables is that they make it easier for you to locate individual data points. As an example, suppose you have a pivot table that summarizes sales data over a series of years. If you want to display the data row that provides the value displayed in a pivot table cell, double-clicking that cell causes Excel to drill down into the data source and create a new worksheet that contains an Excel table with a copy of the appropriate row. So for example, let's say that I wanted to see the row in the data source for this pivot table that provided the value for firm A, 2009, and the month of March. That's the cell that I selected inside the pivot table. To do that, I double-click the cell, and Excel creates a new worksheet, and it shows an Excel table with the entire row providing the data for that cell in the pivot table. Now, this drill down capability only works for one cell at a time, but it is possible to drill down into a data source even if the pivot table draws its data from an external source, such as a database table or another workbook. You can do that because Excel draws the row it displays from the program's internal representation of the data source, which is called the pivot cache, instead of the source table itself. After you've displayed the row providing the value for a pivot table cell, you can press Ctrl-Z to try to delete the worksheet. When Excel indicates that data may exist in the sheet that you've selected for deletion, then click the Delete button in the dialog box. And Excel gets rid of the sheet. Drilling down into the original data source provides context for the data that appears in your pivot tables. Rather than finding the right row among hundreds or even thousands of rows in a source table, you can display just the one you want by double-clicking the cell you want to investigate. When you summarize your data in a pivot table, you might want to display all of the rows in the pivot table, but change the order in which they appear. So let's say, for example, that I have a pivot table here that contains sales data for two companies, broken down by month for the years 2009 and 2010. The current pivot table arrangement organizes the data first by year, and the years are sorted in numerical order, so 2009, 2010, and then the months are sorted January, February, March, and so on in order of the months as they occur in the year, as opposed to an alphabetical order. But let's say that I wanted to sort the data inside the pivot table from highest to lowest. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to find the months where firm B had the highest sales within the year 2009. To do that, I click any cell in the field and in the column that I want to sort, and then on the Options Contextual tab of the ribbon, in the Sort and Filter group, I can click one of three buttons. I can click either Sort Smallest to Largest or Sort Largest to Smallest, or I can create a custom sort by clicking the Sort button. In this case, I'll click the Sort Largest to Smallest button. It goes from Z to A. Click that, and you see that Excel has sorted the pivot table data within each year based on the months for firm B that have the highest sales values. If I wanted to, I could do the same thing for firm A. So click any cell in the firm A column. And then let's say that I want to have the smallest values on top. I can click the Sort Smallest to Largest button and sort in that direction. If I want to undo a sort, then I can press Ctrl-Z or click the Undo button on the Quick Access toolbar. But I'll press Ctrl-Z once to undo the first sort, and then Ctrl-Z a second time to undo the second, and now my data is back in its original order. Sorting a pivot table moves the data you want to highlight to the top of the pivot table, enabling you to concentrate on the values that you want to focus on. Most of the time when you sort pivot table data, you can use the standard methods to sort the values in alphabetical or numeric order. There will be times, though, when you might want to define a custom list of values and sort a pivot table using those values. For example, if your company has stores in 4 regions, North, South, East, and West, and you want the regions to show in that order instead of alphabetical order, you can create a custom list and use that list to sort your field's values. So for this example, I have a pivot table with sales data for 4 regions, East, North, South, and West, but I want to have them sorted into the order North, South, East, and West instead of alphabetical order like they are now. To do that, we can create a custom list. So click the File tab on the ribbon to display the Backstage view, and then click Options to display the Excel Options dialog box. And then on the advanced page, scroll down, which I'll do using my mouse's scroll wheel. And then under the general heading, click the Edit Custom Lists button. Doing so displays the Custom Lists dialog box. Now you can create your list, and in this case we'll do it by typing an N. So here in the List Entries box, we can type North, N-O-R-T-H, then press Enter. Each item needs to be on its own line. Then we have South, S-O-U-T-H, Enter, East, E-A-S-T, Enter, and West, W-E-S-T. So all the entries look to be correct and spelled correctly, so I can click OK. And then click OK again to close the Excel Options dialog box. And now I can sort the field values based on the new list that I just created. Now to sort my row labels, in this case, the regions, into north, south, east, west order. Just click any cell that contains one of those labels. In this case, East is already selected. And then on the Options contextual tab of the ribbon, click the Sort button to display the Sort dialog box, and then select the ascending A to Z option by, and then make sure that the region field is selected, and then click the More Options button. In the More Sort Options dialog box, clear the Sort Automatically checkbox here at the top, and then under First Key Sort Order, click the down arrow, and select the list that you want to use, in this case North, South, East, and West, and then click OK. Then back in the Region dialog box, click OK again, and when you do, Excel applies the sort using your custom list. Custom lists help you arrange your pivot table data to emphasize the elements you feel are most important, making sorting a more powerful and useful tool than ever before. You can use pivot tables to summarize huge data collections, but many times you'll want to limit the data displayed within a given category. For example, if your company's operations are divided into 4 regions, you might want to display just those results for one of the regions. You can limit the data displayed in a pivot table by creating a filter. There are 3 main ways to filter the contents of a pivot table field: by selection, by rule, and by search term. Filtering by selection means that you display a list of values in a field and select the values you want to display. So for example, let's say that I have the results here in this pivot table that displays sales for 4 different regions: East, North, South, and West. And let's say that I only want to display those values for the North and West regions. To do that, I click any cell in the pivot table, and then over in the pivot table field list, I move my mouse pointer over the header of the field that I want to filter, and then click the downward pointing black triangle that appears. And when I do, the Sort and Filter menu appears. In this case, I want to select the values that I want to appear, and those are North and West, so I can go into the filter list, clear the Select All checkbox, and then check North, and scroll down and check West. With those 2 values selected, I can click OK, and Excel applies the filter limiting the data to only North and West. If I want to edit the filter, then I can display the filter menu again, and again that's over in the pivot table field list. And then let's say that I want to display East and West, so I'll clear the checkbox next to North, and check the box next to East, click OK, and Excel updates the filter. If I want to clear the filter, then I can go back into the filter menu, and on the menu, a little bit higher up above the select list, I can click Clear Filter from Region, and the item in double quotes there will change based on the field that you're working with. So in this case, it's Clear Filter from Region. Click it, and Excel restores the pivot table to its unfiltered state. You're not limited to creating one filter at a time. So let's say, for example, that I want to display the values for the North and West regions. So I'll click Region, click the down arrow that appears next to it, clear Select All, and then check the North and West boxes and click OK. And then let's say that I only want to see the values for January and February. So then I'll move the mouse pointer over the month header, click the downward pointing black triangle, clear the Select All checkbox, which removes the check marks from all of the boxes in the list, and then select January and February. When I click OK, Excel applies the second filter to the table. Filtering by selection gives you pinpoint control over the values that appear in your pivot table. You should use this type of filter when you want to display or exclude a few values from the display. Pivot tables help you summarize large amounts of data, But you can always limit the data that appears by creating a filter. If the data you want to display in your pivot table fits a rule, such as all values greater than 1000, you can define that rule and use it to filter your pivot table. To filter a pivot table using the values in a field, you can click any cell in the body of the pivot table and then go over to the pivot table field list task pane and position your mouse pointer over the field that you want to filter by. In this case, I want to filter by month, so I'll move the mouse pointer over that field. And then on the right edge, click the down arrow that appears, and you can select the type of filter that you want to create. You can create two different types of filters, a label filter or a value filter. As the name implies, a label filter lets you filter on the values in the label area. So for example, in this pivot table, we have years 2009, quarters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then months January, February, March, and so on. If we want to filter based on one of those label values, we would create a label filter. However, if we wanted to create a filter based on the values within the data area of the pivot table, then we can create a value filter. So for the month field, I will create a value filter, and then I can select the type of filter that I want to create. So in this case, I want to display any month that has a total of more than $200. So I'll click greater than. And then in the value filter dialog box, I have sum of revenue is greater than. And then I can type in my criteria, which is 200. When I click OK, Excel applies the filter to the pivot table, and you can see that it only displays rows where the grand total is more than 200. To remove the filter, I can go back into the pivot table field list, click the month header, and then click Clear Filter from Month. Now let's say that I want to filter based on label values, and for this example, I want to display only those values for quarters 3 and 4. In other words, quarters with a value greater than 2. To do that, I will filter based on the quarter label. So back in the pivot table field list, I will position my mouse pointer over the quarter field, click the down arrow, point to label filters, and then click greater than. I want to display any quarter that is greater than 2, so I will type 2 in the second box and click OK. When I do, Excel filters the pivot table, so it only displays results from quarters 3 and 4. Filtering pivot table data helps you gain insights into your data by focusing the display on the values you want to examine. You should experiment with the many types of filters available to you, so you'll know which to use to answer particular questions about your data. When you work with a pivot table, you'll often find that you want to locate data that contains a particular string of characters. For example, if you have monthly data, you might want to look for data that only occurs in the months of June and July. Because both of those months have the characters JU next to each other, you can create a filter that looks for exactly those characters. This is a new capability in Excel 2010, and it's called a search filter. To create a search filter, you go over to the pivot table field list task pane, and then you move your mouse pointer over the field name that you want to filter, and in this case we'll filter by month. Then click the downward pointing black triangle that appears, and then type the character string that you want to search for in the search box. In this case, I'm looking for the characters J and U, and when I type that in, you'll see that Excel indicates the values that would be selected if we were to apply this filter. So right now we have June and July. When I click OK, Excel applies the filter to the pivot table. Let's say that I'm interested in June, July, but also August. I can create a second to search filter that adds on to the filter that I've already created. To do that, I'll go back into the filter menu for the month field, and then in the search box, I will type AU. And all the characters I've typed so far occur at the beginning of the month name JU for June and July and AU for August. But the search string that I type in can occur anywhere within the field name. So for example, if I were to type in ER, then I would get December, October, November, and so on. So I've typed in AU, and August is displayed. If I check the Add a Current Selection to Filter box, and then click OK, Excel adds the month of August to the filter. If I want to remove the filter, I can click the month headers down arrow, and click Clear Filter from Month. And when I do, Excel removes the filter. The filters I've created so far using the search capability are the equivalent of what is called a contains filter. In other words, we're looking for values that contain the letters JU in that order. If you want to create the inverse of this type of filter, you can create a does not contain filter. So let's say that I want to exclude any month that has the characters ER in its name. To do that, I can click the month headers down arrow, point to label filter, because I'm filtering based on values in the label area. And then in the list of filters that are available, I can click does not contain. I can type in the characters ER, and again, they can occur anywhere in the month name. Click OK, and Excel limits the data based on that filter. And again, to remove the filter, just click the month headers down arrow and click Clear Filter from Month. Search filters help you limit the data in your pivot table to those values that contain a specific text string. If you find you want to exclude items that contain a common text string, you can also create a does not contain filter to limit your data that way. When you filter a pivot table, Excel indicates that a field has been filtered by placing filter icons in the body of the pivot table and in the pivot table field list. Unfortunately, these icons are small and somewhat hard to see, and also give no indication of which values are included in or excluded from the filter. In Excel 2010, you can filter your pivot tables by using slicers, which graphically indicate which values are included and excluded by a filter. To filter a pivot table using the values in a field, just click any cell to activate the pivot table, and then on the Options Contextual tab, click the Insert Slicer button to display the Insert Slicers dialog box. Now you can check the box next to any of the fields for which you want to create a slicer. So let's say in this case I will do it for month. So I'll just check that box and click OK. When I do, Excel creates a slicer that has an entry for each month that's displayed in the pivot table. When Excel created the slicer, it isn't large enough to display all the values, so I'll move my mouse pointer over the bottom edge of the slicer, and when the mouse pointer changes to an up and down pointing arrow, I can drag down to resize it, and now we can see all of the months. So now let's say that I want to display only those values for the month of May. To do that, I just click the May button, and when I do, Excel displays only the values for 2009 and 2010 for the month of May. Now let's say that I only want to see the values for May and September. To select both of those months, first I select the one that I want, in this case May, and then hold down the Control key and click the second month that I want to display, in this case September. After I release the left mouse button, Excel updates the slicer to indicate that both May and September are selected, and the pivot table updates to show the data for May and September within it. Now let's say that I want to see all of the data for January through April. Instead of control clicking each individual month, what I can do is shift click, and that will select every month in that range. So let's say that I click January and then hold down the shift key. And because I want to see January through April, I click the month of April. And when I do, Excel selects each of the months in the range January through April. If you want to clear a filter applied by a slicer, then you can click the clear filter icon, which is here at the top right corner of the slicer. And also, you can create slicers for more than one field at a time. So let's say that in addition to month, I want to filter by company. To do that, I'll click any cell within the pivot table, and then on the Options Contextual tab, click the Insert Slicer button again. And now I'll select a slicer for company, so I'll check that box, click OK, and I get my second slicer, this time for company. So let's say that I only want to see the values for firm B in August and September. So click firm B, and I'm interested in the months of August and September. So I'll click August and then Control click September to display only the values for firm B in August and September of 2009 and 2010. With that work done, I can clear the slicers by clicking the Clear Filter button in each of them, and then I can remove the slicers by right-clicking it, and then in the shortcut menu that appears, click Remove Company to get rid of the company slicer, and do the same for month, clicking Remove Month to get rid of that slicer. Filtering your pivot tables using slicers helps you and your audience visualize which values are included and excluded from your filter. Slicers work best for filtering fields with 20 or fewer unique values, especially if your pivot table takes up more than half the screen after you apply the filter. Filtering a pivot table using a slicer helps you and your colleagues visualize which values the filter includes and excludes. You have a lot of control over the slicer's appearance and other characteristics, so you can customize it to meet your needs. In this case, I have the year and month fields displayed within a slicer so I can use them to filter my pivot table. One thing that jumps out immediately is that the slicers aren't visually distinguished from the body of the pivot table. They're formatted in pretty much the same way, in other words, so they sort of blend in. What I'd like to do is change the style of the slicers so that they stand out a bit more and makes it easier to see which values are included and excluded from the pivot table. To change the appearance of a slicer, just click the slicer, in this case I'll work with month, and then click the Options contextual tab that appears, and then in the Slicer Styles gallery, click a new style. To see all the styles available to you, click the More button at the bottom right corner of the gallery. And in this case, I'll select the dark red style, just because it stands out the most. And I'll do the same thing for the year slicer. So on the Options tab, I'll click the Dark 2 style, which incorporates dark red. If you want, you can create your own custom slicer style. To do that, click the More button at the bottom right corner of the Slicer Styles gallery, and then click New Slicer Style, and then use the controls to create the style that you want. In this case, I will call the style New Custom. Then I'll just change the color of the header by clicking that header within the slicer element list, and then click Format, and I'll change the fill color to a burnt umber. When I click OK, Excel displays a preview of the style here. And that's the only change I'll make. You can experiment within the other changes that you want to make with any of the other elements, and then click OK. That slicer style appears in your gallery. Clicking the More button, you can see it up here in Custom. So I'll apply that to the active slicer, which is year. If you want, you can also change the caption of a slicer. So for example, the slicer with the orange header has year as its caption. If I want to change that to fiscal year, then with the slicer selected, on the Options contextual tab, I can go over to the slicer caption box and edit the value. So in this case, instead of making it year, I'll make it fiscal year. So FISCAL space capital Y EAR. And when I press enter, Excel changes the value in the header of the slicer. You can also change a slicer's layout. So for example, in the month slicer, we have a list of 12 months. But let's say that I wanted to divide those into 2 columns instead of just 1. To do that, I could select the slicer so that it was active, and you can tell a slicer is active by the border that appears around it. It's called a selection border. And then on the Options contextual tab, in the Buttons group, edit the value in the columns box so that you have the number of columns you want, and in this case, we'll just make it 2. You can also change the height and width of an individual button. So because I'm making it 2 columns, rather than having the width of each individual button be 1.82 inches like it is now, I'll just reduce it to 1. So I'll edit that value, type 1, and press enter. Slicers provide a visual representation of a pivot table filter, so you should take care to format and customize your slicers so they are visually distinctive but don't overwhelm the data within the pivot table. Whenever you add a field to a pivot table's column area or row area, you change the pivot table structure by adding a layer of detail. But suppose you have a great pivot table layout and want to filter the pivot table using the values in a field that doesn't appear within the arrangement. For example, you might want to filter monthly sales by quarter, but without having the quarter field change the pivot table's layout. How do you do that? Well, the answer is that you add the quarter field to the Report Filter field area and create the filters as normal. So the first thing you do is click any cell in your pivot table and make sure that the pivot table field list task pane is displayed. At the bottom of the pivot table field list, you see several different areas. There's the column labels area, the row labels area, and the values area, which allow you to create the structure of the pivot table. The area we haven't covered yet is called the Report Filter area. As the name implies, you can add fields to that area without changing the structure of the interior of the pivot table and create filters to limit the data that appears. So let's say in this case that I wanted to filter based on the values in the quarter field. To do that, I drag the quarter field down to the report filter area, and when I do, Excel asks if I want to replace the contents of the destination cells in sheet 3, and the reason it's asking that is because the value corporate revenue appears in cell A1. Cells A2 and A1 are where the report filter area will go once I add a field to the pivot table, so the contents of cell A1 will be lost. In this case, that's fine. I only put it there as an example, so I can click OK. And when I do, Excel creates the report filter area. Now to create a filter, I can click the down arrow next to the quarter field name. And then the selection list is a little bit different than it is for when you create a value filter or a label filter based on a regular field. In this case, if you want to select a single item, all you need to do is click that item. So let's say that I only want to see the results for quarter number 1. To do that, I click the number 1 and click OK, and Excel displays only those values from January, February, and March of both years. However, let's say that I want to show the results for quarters 1 and 3. To do that, click the filter arrow for the quarter field, and then check the Select Multiple Items box. When you do, you see the familiar selection filter area that we've seen when we created other filters for this pivot table. Simply select any box next to the item that you want to display, in this case 1 and 3, and 4 is unselected. Click OK, and now you see the results for quarters 1 and 3. If you want to clear a report filter, you can just click the down arrow, click the All button, and then click OK. One nice thing about adding a report filter field is that you can create individual worksheets for each of the values in that field. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to create a worksheet that had only data for quarter number 1, another for data with only quarter number 2, and so on through quarter number 4. To do that, make sure that you have a field in the report filter area. You don't have to have a report filter applied at the time. There just needs to be a field in that area. And then on the Options Contextual tab, in the pivot table group, click the Options button, down arrow, and then click Show Report Filter Pages. In the dialog box, make sure that the quarter field appears and is highlighted, and then click OK. When you do, Excel creates a new worksheet, and each worksheet contains data for each value in the field that was in the report filter area. So for example, we have quarter number 1, which is on worksheet number 1, and then worksheet number 2 has the data for quarter 2, worksheet 3, number 3, worksheet 4, number 4. Now these are complete copies of the data. So for example, if I wanted to display all of the data on the 4 worksheet, then I can click All, click OK, and all of the data appears. But when Excel creates the worksheet for you, it's filtered so it only displays the data for an individual item from the field in the report filter area. If you have a worksheet with the same name as one of the field values, Excel names the new sheet value and then parentheses 2. So let's say, for example, that there was already a worksheet named 4 in this workbook. In that case, this worksheet would be named 4, parentheses 2. Filtering pivot tables using fields in the report filter area is a powerful capability. Not only can you limit the data that appears in your pivot table without changing its structure, you can create separate worksheets for each value in the report filter field. You can limit the data that appears in a pivot table by applying a filter, but there would be little sense in applying a filter if you weren't able to remove it later. In Excel, you can remove filters from individual fields, remove all filters at the same time, and reapply filters you just got rid of. So for example, in this pivot table here, I have filters applied to the year and month fields. So let's say that I want to clear the filter from the year field. To do that, I can go into the pivot table field list, click the downward pointing black triangle at the right edge of the year field header, and then click Clear Filter from Year. When I do, Excel removes the filter. Now let's say that I want to bring the filter back. Well, I could either recreate the filter or I could use the Undo feature. To do that, I'll go up to the Quick Access toolbar and click the Undo button. And when I do, Excel reapplies the filter. Now let's say that you have filters in many fields of your pivot table and you want to remove them all at one time. To do that, click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Options Contextual tab, click the Clear button, and then click Clear Filters. Doing so removes every active filter in the pivot table. When you're done with the filter, simply remove it and continue with the rest of your work. You can always recreate the filter, or if you haven't made any changes you don't want to lose, you can also use Ctrl-Z or the Undo button to bring the filter back. When you create a pivot table, Excel applies some basic formatting so you can easily distinguish the labels and organizational layers from the data in the body of the pivot table. Excel does come with a substantial number of built-in styles from which to choose, so if you do want to change your pivot table's formatting, you can do so easily. Before I get into styles, I do want to point out that you can format individual cells within a pivot table and have that formatting stay with the cell when you pivot the table. So for example, let's say that I wanted to highlight the value 130 that is currently in cell C6, and I'll do that just by applying a yellow fill color to that cell. When I pivot the pivot table, that yellow formatting will go along with that cell. So let's say that I put company on top of the row labels area, and when I do, the formatting has stayed with the cell that contains the value 130, and I just scroll down using my mouse wheel to display it. Then if I put company back in the column labels area and scroll back up, then you can see that the cell has retained its formatting. And I'll just go ahead and clear that by clicking the cell and clicking No Fill in the Cell Fill button. If you want, you can change the formatting of your entire pivot table by applying a style, which is available from the Styles gallery. Click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the More button in the Pivot Table Styles gallery to see the styles that are available to you. So I'll just pick another style at random, and I'll select one here that has kind of an orangey burnt umber color. And when I click it, Excel applies that style to the pivot table. And you might have noticed when I moved my mouse pointer over any of the styles in the Styles gallery, that Excel displays a live preview of how that style would look if it were applied to the pivot table. So if I move the mouse pointer over this style or this style, I don't need to actually apply it to have Excel let me know what it would look like if I were to apply it. But now let's say that I have some existing formatting applied to a pivot table. What I'll do now is press Ctrl-Z once to remove the style that I applied, and I'll change the formatting of the Firm A and Firm B cells by pressing Ctrl-I to make the text italic, in addition to being bold. Now there are two ways that I can apply another pivot table style. I can either click the style like I did before, which applies the style and does not overwrite any existing formatting. So let's say that I apply this style. When I do, Excel retains the italic formatting for Firm A and Firm B. However, if I right-click the style, then a shortcut list of options appears, and I can either choose to apply and maintain the formatting, which is the default choice, or apply and clear formatting, which if I select, will apply the style that I just selected and also remove any existing formatting. So whereas the values Firm A and Firm B were in italics before, now they're not. The pivot table styles are part of Office themes, which are collections of predefined color schemes. If you apply a built-in pivot table style and then change the Office theme applied to your workbook, the built-in pivot table style changes as well. So for example, I'll apply another pivot table style, and I'll make it medium 2, which is blue. If I go to the Page Layout tab of the ribbon, and then in the Themes group, click the Themes button to display other Office themes, and I'll select another theme, say Austin. When I hover my mouse pointer over that theme, you can see how in the background it would affect the pivot table style that I had previously selected. So if I were to hover over black tie, you can see how that would change concourse, composite, clarity, and so on. I'm going to exit out without actually applying another theme, but hopefully you'll get the idea of what would happen if you were to change your theme while a pivot table style was applied. After you apply pivot table style, you can turn individual elements on and off. For example, let's say that you apply a style where the even and odd rows are formatted differently. Excel refers to that scheme as banding. So to illustrate the point, I'll go to the Design tab, and then in the Pivot Table Styles gallery, I will apply the style called Pivot Table Light 16. So I'll come down to the third row. There's 15 and there is 16. When I click it, Excel applies it to the pivot table. Now this is a banded style, but the banding doesn't appear because the banded rows checkbox on the Design Contextual tab isn't selected. If I select it, you can see that the alternate rows are dark and light to help distinguish them within the pivot table. Regardless of the style you apply, you can always change the formatting of individual cells. You can also create your own custom styles. I'll show you how to do that in the next movie. The built-in pivot table style gallery contains a lot of good color schemes, but they are by design somewhat generic. When you want to create your own pivot table style to reflect your personal aesthetic or your company's graphic art guidelines, you can do so using the new Pivot Table Quick Style dialog box. To display that dialog box, click any pivot table cell, and then on the Design tab of the ribbon, click the More button at the bottom right corner of the Pivot Table Styles gallery, and then click New Pivot Table Style. The first thing you should do is type a name for your new pivot table style. So if you were creating a style to reflect your company's graphic standards, you could call it something like Graphics Standards 2011. Next, you click the table element you want to change, and then click the Format button to display the formatting tools to apply to that element. So for example, let's say that I want to change the header rows formatting. To do that, I click the header row table element from the list, and then click Format. Then this is the familiar Format Cells dialog box. You can change any aspect of the formatting that you want. So in this case, we'll make the font style bold and the color white. So to do that and to have the text show up, we need to have a dark background. So we'll click Fill, and then I'll select purple. When I'm done in the Format Cells dialog box, I can click OK. And when I do, Excel displays a preview of what my style would look like after I save it. That's the only change I'll make, but you can make changes to any other elements that you like. Just feel free to experiment using the elements in the table element list. When you're ready, go ahead and click OK, and you have created your style. To apply that style, click the More button on the Design Contextual tab, and you'll see your new style at the top of the list in the Custom area. To apply it, just click the style, and Excel applies it to your pivot table. If you want to edit a custom style, just right-click it within the gallery. So click the More button to display the entire gallery, and then right-click your style, and then click Modify. The Modify Pivot Table Quick Style dialog box is essentially the same in all but name as the Create Pivot Table Quick Style dialog box. So for example, let's say that I wanted to add a second row stripe. To do that, I can click Second Row Stripe, click Format, and I'll make every second row a dusty purple. So I've selected the color that I want, click OK, and we see the preview here. Click OK. Now you'll notice that even though I edited the style, the second row stripe doesn't appear, and that's because the banded rows option isn't turned on. So when I go up to the Design tab and check the banded rows box, Excel applies the full style, which includes the second row stripe that I defined when I modified the pivot table style. Now let's say that you want to edit a built-in style. You actually can't, but what you can do is duplicate an existing style and then make changes based on the duplicate. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to create a style that was based on Pivot Style Light 1. To do that, I right-click the style that I want to work with, and then click Duplicate. When I do, Excel creates a new style, and I can change its name, change any of its values, any of its formatting, and so on. It's exactly the same as creating or modifying another pivot table style, so I won't work through all the details. When you're done, you can click OK to save your changes, or do as I will do, which is click Cancel to exit the dialog box without saving your changes. If you want to delete a custom pivot table style, you can right-click the style, and this is the custom style I created earlier, and then on the shortcut menu that appears, click Delete. Excel asks if you're sure, and you can click OK. When you do, Excel reverts to the previous style applied to the pivot table. Now finally, if you want to remove all formatting from your pivot table, click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the More button at the bottom right corner of the Pivot Styles gallery, and then click Clear. Excel gives you the tools to control exactly how your pivot table appears in your workbook. Creating your own formats enables you to control how your pivot table appears in your company's documents and presentations, enhancing your corporate identity while making the data easier for viewers to comprehend. Excel pivot tables enable you to summarize your data in formats that are easy to read and, very helpfully, easy to modify. You can also change your pivot table's layout, choosing whether to display blank rows below each item, and selecting from 3 report layouts with subtle but important differences that are useful for you to know about. By default, Excel pivot tables have no blank rows after an item ends. In this pivot table, there's a subtotal here for yearly sales in 2010, but there's no gap between the summary of 2010 and the last month, December of 2009. If you want to add a blank row there, you can click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the Blank Rows button, and then click Insert Blank Line after each item. When you do, Excel inserts the blank line. If you want to get rid of it, again on the Design tab, click Blank Rows, and click the Remove Blank Line after each item button. As I mentioned before, there are 3 report layout options that display pivot table data in slightly different ways. The first layout I'd like to show you is called Outline View. To display a pivot table in Outline View, go to the Design Contextual tab, click the Report Layout button, and then click Show in Outline Form. Outline Form moves each row label over one column so there's a horizontal gap between them. The first entry under each item, in this case months as part of years, starts 1 row below the header. This view makes it easier to pick out divisions within a pivot table by scanning down the appropriate column. Finally, notice that Outline Form puts subtotals at the top of each group. Tabular form is similar to outline form, but Excel aligns the first detailed row with the header and displays the subtotals at the bottom of each group. To display a pivot table in tabular form, on the Design Contextual tab, click Report Layout, and then click Show in Tabular Form. Finally, you can display your data in compact form. For that, click Report Layout, and click Show in Compact Form. This is the most efficient way to display your pivot table data, but if you're working at a low zoom level or you have a lot of data to work with, it can be hard to pick out individual values. Finally, in Excel 2010, there is a new capability that allows you to repeat a column header. It works in Outline View and Tabular View. So I'm going to switch back to Outline Form, clicking Report Layout, Show in Outline Form. My goal is to have the year 2009 appear next to each of the months in the year, so January, February, and so on. And it won't make a big difference here because all the months fit on one screen, but if you had a category where all of the individual values, such as weeks in a year, didn't fit on a particular screen, then it might be hard for you to remember which year you're working with at one time. So to repeat the value 2009, click any cell in the pivot table, click Report Layout, and then click Repeat All Item Labels. When you do, the labels appear in the body of your pivot table. If you want to get rid of them, click Report Layout, and then click Do Not Repeat Item Labels. Modifying pivot table layouts enables you to present your data as effectively as possible, both for your personal viewing and as part of a presentation. You should take the time to experiment with these options so you can decide which you like best. When you create a pivot table, Excel displays the values in the data fields without any formatting. When you look at numbers in the hundreds and below, the lack of commas and other formatting doesn't really matter. But when you add those values in a subtotal or grand total cell, the lack of thousands separators makes the values harder for humans to process. You can make your data easier to read by changing the data field's number format. To change the number format of a pivot table data field, right-click any cell in the field, and then click Number Format. When you do, the Format Cells dialog box appears, and you can set the format for your cells. In this case, we have a number, so I will click the Number category, and then I can apply settings for these numbers. In this case, all the values I'm working with are whole numbers, so I can set decimal places to 0. And some of my totals go over 1,000, so I will check the Use Thousands separator box. In the United States, the thousands separator is a comma, but if you're in Europe, you might find that they use a period instead of a comma. The thousand separator that appears will depend on your local Windows settings. I don't need to make any other changes, so I can click OK. And when I do, you'll notice that the numbers in the body of the pivot table didn't change. 140 is still 140 and so on. But the grand total for 2009 is 1,887, and the thousands separator, in this case the comma, appears, making the number easier to read. You should always change the pivot table data field's number format if you have any values, including subtotals and grand totals, that could go over 1,000. In general, it's a bad idea to use the currency or accounting formats, mainly because the currency symbols take up space within the cells and can be distracting when you're trying to read numbers in the body of the pivot table. If you are summarizing currency values, use a number format that displays 2 places to the right of the decimal point, so you can include cents in addition to dollars. Pivot tables help you summarize large data collections in an Excel worksheet, but it can be hard to find data that matches specific criteria just by looking at the numbers. It's much easier to change a cell's fill or text color to indicate its relative value. Formats that change the appearance of a cell's contents by applying rules are called conditional formats. Excel lets you apply conditional formatting rules to pivot table cells and have the formats change position when you pivot the pivot table. Creating a conditional format is a lot like creating a filter. In both cases, you create rules to indicate which cells you want to be affected by your action. As an example, I'll create a greater than rule for the revenue field. So for this example, what I'd like to do is highlight any cell that contains a value greater than 100. To do that, click any cell in the field to which you want to apply the conditional format, and then on the Home tab, click the Conditional Formatting button, and then select the type of rule you want to create. In this case, I want to create a highlight cells rules format. So I'll point to that item, and then I can select which of the criteria I want to use. In this case, I want to create a greater than formula. And when I select that option, the greater than dialog box appears. Now I can type in the value that I want the cells to be greater than. So in this case, I want all values greater than 100, so I'll type 100 in the left-hand cell. And then I can click the down arrow in the second box, and I can either select an existing format or I can click Custom Format to create the format that I want. I'll create a simple format. I'll just fill any cell that contains a value that meets my criteria in yellow. So I'm on the Fill Contextual tab, and I'll click the yellow square. Click OK. Everything looks good in this dialog box, so I will click OK again. And Excel applies the format, but only to the selected cell. But you'll notice that there's an Options button that appears next to the cell. When you click that, you're allowed to select which type of cells you want to apply the rule to. There are 3 choices you can make. The first is the selected cell, which means only the cell that you highlighted. Or you can select all cells showing sum of revenue values. When you click that, Excel includes cells that are in the main data area, but also grand totals and subtotals. The third option is all cells showing sum of revenue values for month and company. If you select that option, then Excel excludes any cells in grand total and subtotal rows and columns. In general, you want to apply all conditional formats using the last option, which excludes subtotal and grand total cells. Applying a simple rule-based conditional format can make it much easier to interpret your pivot table data. All you need to do is determine the criteria that reflects the data you want to highlight. Companies of all kinds are interested in their best salespeople, their best customers, and their best-selling products. Excel enables you to create what are called top 10 conditional formats to identify the top or bottom values in a pivot table. You can create 2 types of top 10 conditional formats in Excel: formats that identify a certain number of top or bottom values, or a format that identifies the top or bottom values based on a percentage. For example, if you wanted to identify the top 10% of your customers by sales, regardless of the total number of customers, you could create a percentage-based format. In this case, I have monthly revenue data from 2 companies, Firm A and Firm B, and what I'd like to do is identify the top 7 values within the pivot table. In other words, I don't want to look at totals or grand totals or subtotals. Instead, I want to look at individual months. To create that top 10 conditional format, I'll click any cell in the data area, and then on the Home tab, click Conditional Formatting, point to top/bottom rules, and then select the type of format that I want to create, and in this case, I'll make it top 10 items. I want to format cells that rank in the top 7, so I will edit the value in the number box to the left so that it reads 7. And then I want to create a custom format rather than using any of the existing formats. So I'll click the Format box's down arrow and click Custom Format. And this is the Format Cells dialog box that we're all familiar with. In this case, I will change the format of any cell that contains one of the top 7 values to a light orange. And with that change in place, I'll click OK, and click OK again to accept the format and to apply the change. Now in this case, because I had a single cell selected, Excel only applied the conditional format to that cell. However, if I click the Format Options button, I can select which other cells to apply the format to. Now I could select all cells showing sum of revenue values, but that would include grand totals, subtotals, and so on. So instead, what I want to do is to click the Formatting Options button again and click the final option, which is all cells showing sum of revenue values for month and company. That excludes all of the subtotal and grand total cells. I'd also like to give you an example of how to create a bottom percentage format. So let's say that I want to find the bottom 33% of the values in this pivot table. To do that, click any data cell in the pivot table. One is all reselected, then click Conditional Formatting, point to Top Bottom Rules, and then click Bottom 10%. In this case, I want to identify the bottom 33%. So I will delete the 10 in the percentage box and type 33. And in this case, I'll leave the format exactly the same, light red fill with dark red text. Click OK, and there's the format. Now I want to apply it to all of the cells excluding subtotals and grand totals. So I'll click the Formatting Options button, and then click the last option. Conditional formats that identify the top or bottom values in a pivot table field make it easier for you to visualize the most and least effective performers in your organization. Remember that you can identify a specific number of top or bottom values, or create a rule that identifies the top or bottom percentage of the group, such as the top 15%. This flexibility enables you to create exactly the rule you need. When you summarize numerical data using a pivot table, Excel displays the values with either no formatting, which can make the numbers difficult to interpret, or using a number format. In both cases, to get an idea of how two values compare, you must visually estimate the number of digits used to express the values, and, if they're the same length, focus on the individual digits. Comparing two numbers isn't difficult, but comparing a few dozen or more can be confusing. In Excel, you can add color bars to a cell's background. The length of the bar reflects the relative magnitude of the value in the cell. To create a color bar, click any data cell in the body of the pivot table, and then on the Home tab, click the Conditional Formatting button, then point to Data Bars, and select the type of data bar that you want to create. And there are two different groups within this palette. The first one is the gradient fill, and the second is the solid fill. Gradient fills taper off as they move to the right, so it actually makes it a little bit harder to tell the relative magnitude of values. Those were introduced in Excel 2007, and in Excel 2010, they've been kept for backward compatibility. But I highly recommend that you use one of the solid fill data bar styles, which you can find at the bottom of the palette. So I will select the orange, and when I click it, Excel applies the data bar conditional format to this cell. I actually want to apply this data bar conditional format to all of the cells in the data area, so I can click the Formatting Options button to the right of the cell, and then I can either select all cells showing sum of revenue values, which includes grand totals and subtotals, or I can select the bottom option, which limits the data bar conditional format to those cells within the body of the pivot table, excluding subtotals and grand totals. And the bottom option is the one I want, so I will click it and apply the data bars. You can create a data bar by using one of the 6 default colors, or you can select a custom color. To do that, click the Conditional Formatting button, click Data Bars, and then click More Rules. When you do, you can go down to the Bar Parents section of the New Formatting Rule dialog box and select your color by clicking the Color button, and then selecting a color from the palette. You can also select whether to have a border around the bar. So for example, I currently have no border, but I could make it a solid border, and then choose the color from here if I wanted to. If you have negative values that you want to represent using a data bar, then you can click the Negative Value and Axis button. And that opens a dialog box of the same name, and you can select how to fill negative values. In this case, my example file has no negative values, but I wanted to let you know that these options are here so that you can work with them. I'll click Cancel to close that. And finally, if you only want to display the data bar and not the data behind it, you can select the Show Bar Only checkbox. In this case, I do want to display the value, so I'll clear it. and then click Cancel. One downside to using data bars is that because they fill a percentage of a cell's interior and don't have a fixed maximum length, two cells with the same value can have data bars of differing lengths. In this pivot table, which is laid out in compact form, similar values in columns B and C have differently sized data bars. When I apply data bars to a pivot table, I like to choose outline form as my report layout. To do that, you can click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click Report Layout, and then click Outline Form. When you do, the cells are given identical widths, which makes it easier to compare relative values. Data bars provide a quick visual summary of the relative magnitude of values in your pivot table. When you format your pivot table so the columns are all the same width, the bars provide information that aids your analysis. One of the more recent developments in data presentation is the concept of the heat map, which uses a cell's value to determine which fill color to assign to the cell. Unlike rule-based formats that either apply a color or not, the color scale conditional format applies a color from a 2 or 3 color gradient. Gradients can be hard to visualize if you've never worked with one before, so I'll start with an example and then show you how to create it. I applied a yellow to red format to this pivot table's data field. The lower the value, the more yellow the cell's interior color. The higher the value, the more red. The middle values, which in this example are all around 50%, are filled with a mix of yellow and red, making orange. So you can see the 100% are very dark. The 49% is toward the middle, and lower values such as 8 or 7% have a lot of yellow in them. Now I'm going to clear the format from the pivot table, and to do that I'll just click Conditional Formatting, Clear Rules. I'll just clear rules from this pivot table to get rid of it. To create a color scale using a built-in format, you can click any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Home tab, click Conditional Formatting, point to Color Scales, and then select the color scale that you want. You can choose from 2 color scales and 3 color scales. And yes, the yellow-red scale I showed you has orange at the middle, but 3 color scales have a middle color that also affects the format. Let's say that you wanted to apply the green, yellow, red format, and that is where the highest values have green, the middle values have yellow, and the red values are the lowest. If I click that within the palette that appears, Excel applies that format, but only to the active cell. If I want to apply it to other cells within the pivot table, I can click the Formatting Options button, and then click the last option, which applies the format to all cells showing sum of usage for workstation and day, which means that it would exclude any subtotal or grand total cells that were included in the pivot table. When you apply that format, you see that the highest values are green, the middle values are yellow, and the low values are red. The values between the middle and the high are yellowish-green, and the values between the middle and the low are yellowish-red or orange. Now once again, I'm going to clear this particular format. Go to Conditional Formatting, Clear Rules from this pivot table, and now I'm going to create my own custom color scale. And to do that, I will go back to the Conditional Formatting Color Scales menu and then click More Rules. We can now use the controls in the New Formatting Rule dialog box to create our custom color scale. The first thing I'm going to do is select the All Cells Showing Sum of Usage values for workstation and day, which again applies the format to all cells within the pivot table but not subtotal or grand total cells. And then I'll use the controls at the bottom end in the Edit the Rule description to create my custom 2-color format. For the lowest values, I'm going to choose yellow. So we have minimum and type indicating that this is the lowest value. Click Color, and I'll just select yellow. And then for the highest values, I will select blue. With those selections in place, I can click OK, and Excel applies the format. You go through exactly the same procedure when you create a 3-color scale, but there, you obviously have to pick the middle color as well. Color scales provide terrific visual feedback for resource utilization maps. If you run a grocery store and want to track which shelf positions get the most traffic, or if you run an internet cafe and track workstation usage, a color scale conditional format will indicate which resources are the most and the least popular. One of the most popular trends in corporate management is to use icons to indicate how a company's performance compares to its goals. If you set up your workbook as a dashboard that summarizes performance, you can use indicators such as the familiar red, yellow, and green stoplight images to indicate acceptable, unacceptable, and excellent results. In Excel, such a group of indicators is called an icon set. To apply an icon set conditional format to a pivot table, click any cell in the pivot table data field, then on the Home tab, click the conditional formatting button, point to icon sets, and then at the bottom, click More Rules. When you do, the new formatting rule dialog box appears. The first thing you can do is select which cells to apply the rule to. And in this case, you only want the cells in the body of the pivot table, not the grand total or subtotal cells. So you should select the third option, which is all cells showing sum of revenue values for month and company. Next, you can select the icon style that you want. So if you click the down arrow, you can select, and I usually prefer to use the black rimmed traffic lines. And now you can establish your rules. Now it's very important that you select the type of rule you want to create first. In this case, this pivot table contains numerical data as opposed to percentages, so we will create a number type of rule. So I'll click the type down arrow in the first row and click number. When you select a new type, Excel resets the rule so you can define its values. So in the value field, I want to show a green light for anything 100 or higher. So I will edit that value so it reads 100. And then I can select the type for the rule that will define what shows a yellow light. So click the second type cell and click number. And for that value, I'll click 50. So that rule says that it will display a yellow light for any value less than 100 and greater than or equal to 50. And the final rule says that it will show a red light for anything else. So with those changes in place, I can click OK. And Excel applies the conditional format to the body of the pivot table. Icon sets can provide useful information about large data sets, but they really come into their own when you use them to summarize a relatively small amount of data. If you or your executive team monitor company performance using dashboards, you should strongly consider using icon sets to enhance your ability to understand the dashboard summary at a glance, and also to determine where to reward strong performance and investigate underperformance. After you create a conditional formatting rule, you might need to change it to reflect new operating conditions or goals at your company. For example, you might revise your sales targets to reflect an economic downturn, or you could decide to pay a bonus to the top 15% of your sales representatives instead of your top 10 because you had a great year. To edit a conditional format, you click any cell that contains the format, as I've done here, and then on the Home tab of the ribbon, click the Conditional Formatting button, and then click Manage Rules. When you do, the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager dialog box appears, and then you can click any rule that you want to edit. In this case, there's only one, so I will click it, so it's highlighted in blue, and then to open the editing box, I'll click the Edit Rule button. You can use the controls in the Edit Formatting Rule dialog box to change every aspect of your conditional format, including the type of rule, the cells to which it's applied, and the rule's conditions. Now in this case, I have an icon set conditional format, and just as an example, I'll change it to a color scale using the same conditions. So the conditions that I have are green for the high values, in this case greater than or equal to 115, yellow for anything that is less than 115 but greater than or equal to 50, and red for everything else. So to change the type of rule, I will click the Format Style down arrow, and then click To Color Scale. And the reason that I click 2 color instead of 3 color is because in a 2 color scale, the top and bottom colors will combine to form a third color. So for example, if we had red and yellow as my 2 colors, then we would have orange in the middle. So I'll pick a couple of colors here. So for the lower values, I'll make it yellow. And then the color for the higher values, I will make blue. And when I click OK, Excel displays a preview of the conditional format in the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager. And when I click OK, Excel applies the rule to my worksheet. You're not stuck with a conditional format after you create it. You can change any aspect of the rule you like, so feel free to experiment with the rule that provides you with the information you and your audience require. Excel lets you create many types of conditional formats, and it gives you many ways to manage those rules. For example, in Excel 2003 and earlier, each cell could have up to 3 conditional formatting rules applied to it. What's more, only one of those rules could be applied at the same time. When Excel discovered that one rule was true, it simply stopped checking. In Excel 2010, There is no practical limit to the number of conditional formatting rules you can apply to a cell. It's also possible for more than one conditional formatting rule to be applied at the same time. So let's say that you have applied a number of conditional formatting rules to your pivot table and you want to go in and manage how they are applied. To do that, click any cell in the body of the pivot table, and then on the Home tab, click Conditional Formatting, and then at the bottom of the menu that appears, click Manage Rules. When you do, the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager appears, and it lists each of the formats you've created. The first thing you should do is ensure that you are working with the rules applied to the pivot table. To do that, you can look at the value in the Show Formatting Rules For box, and in this case it does say this pivot table. If you click the down arrow, you can see the other options, which are the current selection, this worksheet, this pivot table, which is currently selected, and then either sheet 2 or table 1. So all those are options, and in this case, this pivot table is selected and it's correct. So I'll click outside the list to close it. In Excel 2003 and earlier versions, the program stopped checking conditions when it found one that was true. Excel 2010 doesn't stop checking conditions unless you tell it to. So for example, if you want Excel to stop checking conditions if a particular condition is true, you can check that condition's Stop If True box. So for example, let's say that if the cell value is greater than 110 and you wanted Excel to stop checking after that, then you could check the Stop If True box. In this case, I don't want to make that change, so I'll clear the box, but it's there if you wanted it. You can also change the order in which Excel applies these rules. So let's say, for example, that I have the bottom rule here, which is called Top 7. So what it does is it finds the top 7 monthly sales values within the pivot table, and then it formats the number within that cell as bold and italicized. So now let's say that you want Excel to check that rule first. To do that, you can click the rule to select it, as I've done, and then click the Move Up arrow, and I'll move it to the top of the list. So we have 1, 2, and 3 clicks, and then that has moved to the top of the list. If you want to move a condition down, then you can click the condition and click the Move Down button. So now let's say that Excel has discovered a value that's in the top 7, and I only wanted to apply this formatting as opposed to the color fill down below. Now I can check the Stop If True box, and then click OK. When I do, Excel reapplies the conditional formats as I edited them. You see that the top 7 values in the pivot table, which include 130, 140, 128, and so on, don't have a color fill as the other cells do. Instead, they simply have their text in bold and italic type. Managing conditional formats is a little complicated, but that's the price you pay for a lot more flexibility. If you take the time to work with your rules, you'll discover many benefits to the additional visualizations offered by Excel's conditional formats. Conditional formats help you make judgments about your data quickly, but you might find that one or more of the rules you created are no longer useful. If that's the case, you can delete rules individually from the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager, or get rid of them all by using the controls on the Home tab of the ribbon. If you want to delete a single rule, then on the Home tab of the ribbon, click Conditional Formatting, and then click Manage Rules. Then in the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager dialog box, you can select the rule that you want to delete. So for example, if we wanted to delete the rule that identifies the top 7 values, then I could click it and then click Delete Rule. You should always verify that any remaining rules operate the way you want them to. For example, if the rule you got rid of had a Stop If True condition, you might have disrupted the rule's logic and caused Excel to apply rules it shouldn't. When you're done managing the rules inside this dialog box, you can click OK to save your changes, or cancel if you want to close the dialog box without saving your changes. If you want to remove a particular set of conditional formats, then you can do so by once again on the Home tab, clicking Conditional Formatting, and then pointing to Clear Rules. And when you do, a number of choices come up. Clearing rules from just the selected cells works as advertised. It removes conditional formats from just those cells that you've selected. Clearing rules from the entire sheet removes all conditional formats from the worksheet, not just the pivot table. When the active cell lies within an Excel table, the Clearing Rules from this table option deletes conditional formats from that Excel table. In this case, the active cell isn't within an Excel table, so that option's grayed out here. And finally, Clearing Rules from this pivot table removes rules from the pivot table, but doesn't affect any rules elsewhere on the worksheet. So for example, if I were to click Clear Rules from this pivot table, Then Excel would remove those rules, but wouldn't affect anything else within the worksheet if other rules were applied. Getting rid of conditional formats you no longer need reduces the visual input you have to process when you view a pivot table. If you find that a conditional format is more of a distraction than a help, don't hesitate to get rid of it. Pivot tables help you summarize large data sets efficiently, but it can be difficult to interpret data when all you have to go on are the raw numbers. Charts summarize data visually, making it easier to distinguish groupings and trends in your data. Just as you can create charts based on regular worksheet data sets, you can create dynamic charts, called pivot charts, from the data contained in pivot tables. There are two ways to create a pivot chart. You can either create a pivot table and a pivot chart at the same time, or you can create a pivot chart from an existing pivot table. To create a pivot table and a pivot chart at the same time, you need to make sure that your source data, such as what I have here, is laid out as a data list or preferably an Excel table. Then on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table button's down arrow and click Pivot Chart. When you do, the Create Pivot Table with Pivot Chart dialog box opens. You can then verify that Excel has identified the range properly, and in this case, it is a table named Table 1, and you can choose where to create the pivot table in Pivot Chart, and I will create it on a new worksheet. With those selections in place, click OK. After you create your pivot chart, you can arrange the fields using the controls in the Pivot Table Field List task pane, just like you would for a pivot table. So for example, if I want to display yearly revenues, I could create a column chart doing exactly that. Now I'll show you how to create a pivot chart based on an existing pivot table. To do that, you display a sheet that contains a pivot table, so I'll go to Sheet 3, click any cell in the pivot table, and then you simply create a chart as you would normally in Excel. You click the Insert tab, and then select the type of chart you want to create. In this case, I will create a column chart, so I'll click the Column button, and then just create a simple clustered column. And when I do, Excel creates a chart that reflects the organization of the pivot table. And again, you can pivot the pivot table to change the pivot chart. So for example, if I pulled the month field out of the Axis Categories area, then I would have a column chart with data for Firm A and Firm B in 2009 and 2010. Now there are some differences between regular Excel charts and pivot charts. The most important ones are that you can't switch the row and column orientation of the pivot chart by using the Select Data Source dialog box. That's not much of a problem though, because you can always rearrange your data by pivoting the pivot chart. Second, you can't create XY scatter charts, stock charts, or bubble charts. And finally, refreshing a pivot chart removes trend lines, data labels, error bars, and a few other less common settings. If you'd rather have your pivot chart reside on a separate worksheet from the pivot table, you can click the pivot chart, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the Move Chart button, and then select where you want the chart to go. In this case, we'll put it on a new chart sheet, and we'll just leave the name as Chart 1, and click OK. I personally prefer a chart sheet because the pivot chart takes up an entire sheet, and the larger area makes the chart easier to understand. Pivot charts enable you to summarize your data visually, providing an overview of your data and opening the door to insights you might not discover from looking at the raw numbers. You'll find that pivot charts are powerful tools that help you analyze your enterprise's data effectively. The real power of a pivot chart comes to the fore when you rearrange your data dynamically. A task that would take several minutes if done by hand takes just a few seconds when you summarize your data using a pivot chart. So now let's say that you have a pivot chart and you want to pivot it. You can pivot either the pivot chart itself or the pivot table behind it. So let's start out by pivoting the pivot table, which is on the left side of the screen. And I currently have the data laid out by year and month along the rows, which is along the horizontal axis on this line chart, and then company, which provides the Firm A and Firm B lines. So there are two separate lines. Each one represents a single company. If I were to remove company from the column labels area by dragging it out, then Excel creates a chart where it summarizes all of the data instead of separating it out by company. And now let's say that I want to create a separate line for each year. So in other words, I want to have January, February, and March, and then I want to have two separate lines representing the years 2009 and 2010. To do that, I can drag year from the row labels area to the column labels area, and Excel creates a graph with those two separate lines. If you have your pivot chart on a separate sheet within your workbook, then you can pivot the pivot chart on its own. So let's say, for example, that I click the pivot chart, and when I do, we still see the pivot table field list. But now the names of the areas have changed. So instead of the column area, we have what's called legend fields, and then we have axis fields, which was previously the row labels area. Every unique value in any field within the legend fields area will have a separate line or bar or column in the body of the chart. So for example here, we have year, and because I have data from 2009 and 2010, I have two lines, one red, one blue, summarizing data for 2009 and 2010. Now if I want to pivot the pivot chart, I can do so normally. So for example, if I want to take a year and put it back in the axis fields area, I can do so and create a line chart, which summarizes all revenue for 2009 and 2010 by month. And then I can add company back to the legend fields area to create two separate lines, one for firm A and one for firm B. And also, as with a pivot table, you can defer the layout update. So if you have a large pivot chart or a large pivot table and it takes time to summarize all the data, then you can check defer layout update and then make your changes, and I'll just change back by removing company and putting year in the legend fields area. You'll notice that when I made those changes, the pivot chart and the pivot table did not change. But when I click update, everything updates to reflect my changes. If you want to go back to live updating to have the pivot chart and pivot table update as you make your changes, then you can uncheck the deferred layout update box. Changing the pivot chart's arrangement shifts the data's emphasis, enabling you to examine the data from different perspectives quickly and easily.
Pivot charts can summarize huge data collections, but many times you'll want to limit the data displayed in a given category. Just as you can limit the data displayed in a pivot table, you can also limit the data summarized by a pivot chart by creating a filter. There are three main ways you can filter the contents of a pivot chart: by selection, by rule, and by using a search filter. Filtering by selection means that you display a list of the values in a field and select the values you want to display. Filtering by rule means that you create a criteria that Excel uses to select which values to display. And finally, creating a search filter means that you type in a character string that you want to appear in all of the labels that appear in the body of the pivot chart. You can create filters for a pivot chart by using the pivot table field list, and the procedure is exactly the same as if you were creating a filter for a pivot table. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to create a filter where I only displayed values for January, April, July, and November. To do that, I can move the mouse pointer over the month field, click the down arrow, and then using the selection list, I can select the months that I want. So have select all and do it for January, April, July, and November. With those selections in place, I can click OK, and Excel updates my pivot chart to use just those values. If I want to remove the filter, then I can move back into the pivot table field list, click the down arrow, and click Clear Filter from Month. Now let's say that I want to filter by rule. Say that I want to display results only for quarters 3 and 4. In other words, any quarter with a number greater than 2. To do that, I will pivot the pivot chart by removing the month field and adding the quarter field to the axis fields area. So now I have my results by quarter for each of the years 2009 and 2010. To create that rule, I will click the quarter field headers down arrow and then point to Label Filters, click Greater Than, and then I want any quarter with a value greater than 2, so I'll type 2 in the box to the right, verifying that is greater than appears in the comparison operator box. Click OK, and Excel updates my pivot chart based on my filter. I will once again clear that filter, going into the pivot table field list box and clicking Clear Filter. Now let's say that I want to create a search filter. To do that, I will bring month back in. So I'll take quarter out and add the month field back into the axis fields area. And now let's say that I want to filter for any month that includes the letters ER in the name of the month. So to do that, I will click the month headers down arrow, and then in the search box, I'll type ER. When I do, Excel updates the contents of the search list indicating that September, October, November, and December will all appear when I create my filter. Everything looks good, so I can click OK, and Excel filters the pivot chart. And if you want, you can always create multiple filters. So let's say that I was only interested in the values for 2010. I can go up to Year, click the down arrow, and clear the Select All button, and check 2010, click OK, and I see the results for September, October, November, and December of 2010. Creating filters gives you control over the values that appear in your pivot chart. When you want to narrow your focus and examine a subset of your data, pivot chart filters enable you to do just that.
Charts, including pivot charts, summarize data visually, so you should pay careful attention to the appearance of your chart and the elements it contains. If your organization mandates which color schemes you need to use for external or internal documents, you should also ensure your pivot charts conform to those production standards. If you want to change the look of your pivot chart, then first you should click the pivot chart so that it's active, and then you can make a number of changes. If you want to change your pivot chart's chart style, you can do that by clicking the Design Contextual tab, and then clicking the More button in the Chart Styles gallery, and then selecting the style that you want to apply. In this case, I will select the style here, which is called Style 42. And when I click it, Excel updates the formatting of the pivot chart. You can also format individual chart elements. So let's say, for example, that I want to change the formatting of the title, which is Revenue. I move my mouse pointer over that element, and when I do, Excel displays the chart title screen tip indicating that I'm currently hovering over that item, and when I click it, it's selected. And then I can go to the Format Contextual tab, and then use the controls to change the formatting of this particular item. So for example, I can make it a word art style by clicking the Styles Gallery's More button, and then selecting one of the existing styles, and I will select the Fill White with a drop shadow. If you want, you can also select a chart element using the Chart Elements list. To do that, you go to the Format Contextual tab, and then in the Current Selection area, click the Chart Elements box's down arrow and select the item you want. In this case, I'll click the Chart area. Now to change the formatting of the chart area, I can use the controls again on the Format Contextual tab, and in this case, I will change the shape style so that it has a red border and white interior. With that in place, I'll click the style to apply it. Now let's say that you want to format a single data point within your chart. So let's say that I want to format this column, which is for Firm B, 2009, April. The first thing I do is click the element once. Doing so selects all of the data within that data series. If I click it again, then Excel selects that item by itself, and I can change its formatting. So let's say that I want to change the color of the fill. To do that, I can click the Shape Fill button, and then select a new color, and in this case, I'll make it yellow. Now, one thing you should note is that, like other formatting elements, the colors you select might be affected if you apply a different Office theme to your document. So for example, the color that I selected was yellow, and if I reopen the Shape Fill palette, you'll see that yellow is in the Standard Colors area. That means that it won't be affected if I change the Office theme. If I'd selected one of the colors from the Theme Colors area, then it would change. So let me show you what happens when I change the Office theme for this workbook. To do that, I go to the Page Layout tab, click the Themes button, and then select the new theme that I want, and in this case, I'll call it Equity. You can see that the rest of the data columns have changed, but the yellow has not. Formatting pivot chart elements helps communicate important trends clearly. Whether you use formatting to provide an overall look and feel, or to call out individual data points, you should take the time to experiment with different formatting options and see which works the best for you and your audience. When you create a pivot chart, Excel uses a basic layout to determine when and where to display elements. Those elements can include the chart title, a legend representing the data series, and axis titles and labels. The basic layout Excel uses is probably good enough for a quick look at your data, but you will most likely want to change how your pivot chart's elements are arranged before you share your chart with your colleagues. For example, Excel comes with a gallery of chart layouts from which to choose. You can display those layouts by clicking Your Pivot Chart, and then on the Design Contextual tab, clicking the More button at the bottom right corner of the Chart Layouts gallery. Then you can click the layout that you want to apply, For this example, I'll just click the top left, which is layout number 1. And when I do, Excel changes the chart's layout. Even if the layout you choose includes elements such as a title or legend, those items either won't appear or will display a placeholder, in this case, chart title, if the pivot chart's arrangement doesn't supply a value for that element. In this example, I'm summarizing the data using a column chart and have company in the axis fields area and here in the legend fields area. The default pivot chart layout won't display a chart title unless I created it myself. So how would you do that? Well, to edit your chart element, you can click it to select it, and then you can move the mouse pointer over the edge of the item and then drag it to any place that you like on the pivot chart. And then if you want to undo something, you can just press Ctrl Z, and I'll press Ctrl Z again to put the chart title back in this original place. And then you can edit the text by selecting the text and then changing it to company by year. And then if you click the item to select it, you can use the tools on the Home tab to change the formatting of the text. So let's say, for example, that I want to make the text a little bit larger, make it 24 point. I can do that using the tools that you're familiar with from your regular reuse of Excel. You can also delete a chart element. And while I have my chart title selected, if I press the delete key, it goes away. However, if I reapply the layout I had before by clicking Chart Layouts and then Layout 1, then the chart title element comes back, but the previous value is lost. If you want more fine-grained control over your pivot chart's layout, then you can click the pivot chart and then click the Layout Contextual tab on the ribbon. And doing so allows you to change many different aspects of your chart. For example, you can add axis titles to the pivot chart. To do that, you click the Axis Titles button, which is here, and then select whether and how to display the horizontal or vertical axis title. So we'll look at the horizontal axis, and then you can either display it as none or the title below the axis. I'll choose that second option, and you see that we have an axis title, and in this case, that is the year. So I will select the text inside the chart element and type year. You should take the time to experiment with the built-in layouts available for you to use with Excel pivot charts. You might discover that most of your design work has already been done. Excel lets you create pivot charts that summarize your pivot table data visually. You can often use more than one type of chart to summarize a data set, so you might want to change your pivot chart's type. I'll show you the procedure to change a pivot chart's chart type, and in doing so, I'll give you an overview of the different chart types that are available within Excel 2010. First, I should point out that you can't create an XY scatter chart, a stock chart, or a bubble chart using pivot table data. This first chart type, which is the column chart, displays data as vertical columns organized by category, and these charts are useful for showing data changes over a period of time or for illustrating comparisons among items. Now, let's say that I want to change this chart to a line chart. To do that, I'll click the pivot chart, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the Change Chart Type button, and then I can click the type of chart I want to create, and I'll click the first line subtype. And with that selection in place, I'll click OK, and Excel creates a new graph based on my choice. Line charts display continuous data over time, which is perfect for showing trends in data as long as the data was captured at equal intervals. Comparing a month's sales to a year's sales doesn't make sense within the context of a line chart. Pie charts show the share of a total contributed by individual data values in a single data series. So let's change this chart to a pie chart. So on the Design Contextual tab, change chart type. Click pie, and I'll use the first pie subtype and click OK. Pie charts show the share of a total contributed to by the individual data elements in a series. If you have more than one data series in your pivot table, Excel displays just the first one in your pivot chart. So let's say, for example, that I have two companies, Firm A and Firm B, and I will add those companies to the Legend Fields area. In this case, Excel only shows Firm A. If I were to add the company field to the Axis Fields area, though, by dragging it from the Legend Fields to the Axis Fields area, then Excel would create 4 different divisions: 2009 Firm A, 2009 Firm B, and the same for 2010. Now I'll remove company from the pivot chart to go back to our simple data type, and I'll create a bar chart. So click the pivot chart and then on Design tab, change a chart type, and then click bar. I'll use the first type and click OK. Bar charts, which display values as horizontal bars, are perfect for summarizing data when the axis labels are long and the values that are shown are durations. So even though I have sales data here, most of the time you'll use bar charts 4 times. So for example, in project management. The next type of chart I'd like to show you is what's called an area chart. So I will change the pivot chart to that type. Click OK. And what you see is an area chart that instead of a line chart, the entire body of the graph is filled in. So in this case, we have the total from 2009 to 2010. Now let me show you what it looks like when I add a company back to the legend fields area. So I'll drag the company field there. What this area chart does is emphasize the magnitude of change over time and also how much each data element contributes to the total for a given measurement. Now the final 2 chart types that I'd like to cover don't work extremely well with the data that I have in this pivot chart, so bear with me and I'll just explain the concepts. The next type of chart is what's called a surface chart. So change the data type to surface and I'll just select the first one. Surface charts are used mostly for scientific data. You can use surface charts to find the optimum combination of 2 data sets, such as comparing rainfall and crop production. Now finally, radar charts enable you to compare the aggregate values of several data series. So I will change the type to a radar chart and click OK. And then I will add company to the axis fields area. So you can see the relative contribution for 2009 firm B's revenue, 2010 firm A, firm B in 2010, and firm A in 2009. Selecting the best pivot chart type to summarize your data will add clarity to your presentations. You should take the time to study the type of data you're analyzing and use that information to select the most appropriate pivot chart. When you analyze data using a pivot chart, you must pay close attention to the individual values in your data sets. Even so, it's often beneficial to take a step back and look at the overall trends in your data. You can enhance your analysis by projecting future values, assuming current trends stay constant, by adding a trend line to your pivot chart. To create a pivot chart trend line, you can click the pivot chart, and then on the Layout Contextual tab, click the Trend Line button, and then select the type of trend line that you want to create. So in this case, I'll click a linear trend line, which creates a line that best fits with the data that's displayed within the pivot chart. Now the trend line only exists within the chart and the Excel program memory. It doesn't actually add data to your worksheet. And I should also point out that Excel uses linear regression techniques to create the trend line. These techniques are also implemented in the forecast function, so you can generate the same results for data you don't summarize within a pivot chart. Now, one other note is that you should always use linear for your forecast type unless you know that you need to use another type of trend line. Most of the time, you'll only use the other types of regression for scientific and engineering work, and you'll know when you need to use them. If you'd like more control over your trend line, make sure that the chart is still selected, and then on the Layout tab, click the Trend Line button again, and then click More Trend Line Options. When you do, the Format Trend Line dialog box opens. One of the more common changes that I make is to extend the trend line by 4 periods to take it out into the future. So let's say, for example, that I have a linear trend line, which I do, and I want to create what's called a forecast to look forward. And in this case, I want to go from 0 periods to 4 periods. And in this case, each of my periods is, if we look back at the chart, 1 month. So with that change in place, I can click Close. And a trend line looking ahead 4 months appears in the body of the pivot chart. Please note, though, that the farther out you make your forecasts, the more likely they are to be inaccurate. But even so, a trend line gives you a basis for comparison. Trend lines help you visualize future trends in your data. A pivot chart can't replace detailed analysis, but they do help set the stage for your presentations regarding that data. When you create a pivot table position that illustrates a point well, you can print the pivot table and include it in a physical document. In this movie, I'll show you how to print your pivot tables. First, you can preview how your pivot table will look when you print it by going to the Backstage view. To do that, click the File tab, which displays the Backstage view, and then click the Print item to display the print page, and on the right side of that page is a print preview. So you can see the pivot table and also the data comment that is over to the side, which would also be printed. So let's say that I just want to print the pivot table and not the comment over on the side. To do that, I click the Home tab of the ribbon, then click the Options tab, and then click the Select button, and click Entire Pivot Table. So what I've just done is selected the entire pivot table. Now I can go to the Page Layout tab, click the Print Area button, and click Set Print Area. When I do, and I'll just click away from the selected cells to release the selection, you can see that Excel has dashed lines around the area that was selected, indicating it's a print area. And in fact, if we go back to the Backstage view and the print page, you can see that the comment text over on the side will no longer be printed because it was outside of the print area. So now let's switch back into the document proper, and I'll just click the Home tab. Now let's say that I want to have the titles appear on each printed page, and let me show you what I mean. First, I'll create a page break here on row 18, and my goal is to split the values from 2009 and 2010 onto two separate printed pages. So I've clicked the row header, and then I'll go to Page Layout, click Breaks, and then click Insert Page Break. And when I do, you can see that there will now be a page break between December 2009 and the summary for 2010. And if we go to the Backstage view, File, then Print, you can see that we have the values on page 1, that's 2009. And then if I go to the next page, you can see the values for 2010. But what you also see are that there are no headers for 2010. So for example, I might not remember that the first column is firm A and the second column is firm B because those labels don't appear. So what I'll do now is set up my worksheet so that those labels will appear when I print the pivot table. To do that, I'll go back into the main document and I'll just click the Home tab and then right-click any cell in the pivot table and click Pivot Table Options. Then on the printing page of the dialog box, check the Set Print Titles box and then click OK. Now when we go back to the Backstage view and preview our print job to come, we'll see that on the first page we have our headers, and then on page 2, they appear as well. There's one other option I'd like to show you when it comes to printing pivot tables, and that is that you can turn the expand and contract controls on or off. In other words, you can print them or not. So I'll click the Home tab again to go back into the pivot table. Right-click any cell within the pivot table, click Pivot Table Options again, and then on the printing page, you can select whether to print the expand and collapse buttons that are displayed on the pivot table. In this case, it's turned off, which is usually the better choice, but I'll just show you what they look like when you have them turned on. So I'll check that box, click OK, and then go back to Print Preview. And you can see that the button will appear when you print the worksheet. Printing a pivot table seems like a straightforward operation, and it usually is. That said, you do have a number of options when it comes to printing your pivot table. You should experiment with the different ways you can control how your pivot tables print so you can get exactly the output you want. When you create a pivot table, it's likely that you'll have data from many categories grouped together into a single display. If that's the case, it might make sense to print your data on a number of worksheets. There are two ways that you can separate your pivot table data. The first is by using the fields in the row labels area, and the second is by using fields in the report filter area. If your pivot table has more than one field in the row labels area, you can have Excel print each group on a new page. For example, in this worksheet, I have data from 2009 and 2010, and let's say that I wanted to print 2009 and 2010 on separate worksheets. To do that, you right-click any cell in the label field by which you want to separate. In other words, I want to separate by year, so I'll click one of my two year fields. In this case, right-clicking 2009. In the shortcut menu that appears, click Field Settings. In the Field Settings dialog box, the setting that we're interested in is on the Layout and Print page. And at the bottom of this page, you can check the Insert Page Break after each item box, and then click OK. You don't see anything on the screen, but if you go to Backstage View by clicking the File tab, and then click Print, you can see that 2009 will be printed on one page, and then if we scroll to the next page, 2010 will be printed there. Now click any tab on the ribbon to switch back. Now let's say that you create a filter using the report filter area, which I'll do by dragging the quarter field down to the report filter area. So now I have the ability to filter the data that appears in the pivot table. In this case, however, what I want to do is to print data from quarter number 1 on one page, quarter number 2 on another page, and so on. So the first thing I'll do, and this is just personal preference, but I'm going to remove the print area that's been set so that I have 2009 and 2010 on the same page. In other words, I don't want to have two settings at the same time. So I will right-click a value in the year field, click Field Settings, go to the Layout and Print page and clear the Insert Page Break after each item checkbox, and click OK. Now, with any cell in the pivot table selected, I can go to the Options Contextual tab, and then in the pivot table group, I click the Options buttons down arrow, and then click Show Report Filter Pages. In the dialog box that appears, I verify that the quarter field appears, and that is the report filter page that I want, and click OK. When I do, Excel creates 4 different worksheets, one displaying data from quarter 1, the second, quarter 2, 3, and 4. And you can see those new worksheets down here on the tab bar with worksheets 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now let's say I want to print all those worksheets. To do that, I select sheet number 1, and then holding down the Shift key, I click the tab for sheet number 4. Then, if I go to the print page of the Backstage view and print my workbook, these 4 worksheets will all be printed. The built-in Excel pivot table functionality enables you to separate your data when you print without necessarily separating the data in the workbook. Creating new worksheets for each item in the report filter area does add worksheets to your workbook, but setting the Insert Page Break after each item option enables you to separate those categories of data without affecting your pivot table's organization. When you're ready to print a pivot chart, you can use the same skills you've used to print regular charts. In this lesson, I'll review some of the techniques you can use to make printing your pivot chart go smoothly. There are 2 scenarios for printing a pivot chart. The first is if the pivot chart is part of a worksheet, and the second is if it's on its own chart sheet. If the pivot chart is part of a worksheet, then click the pivot chart, and then click the File tab to go to the Backstage view, and click Print. When you do, the print page of the Backstage view appears, and you'll see under Settings that Print Selected Chart is automatically selected. And in fact, if you click the button that allows you to select which part of the workbook to print, the only one that's available is Print Selected Chart. So now you can select your printer and click the Print button. But now, let's say that the pivot chart is on its own chart sheet. So I'll click the Home tab on the ribbon to move back, and then I'll shift to the chart sheet named Chart 1. And here we see another pivot chart that's on its own sheet. Now, if you click the File tab and click Print, you'll see that you have a few more options. For example, if you click the Settings button, you see that you can print the entire workbook and not just the chart. As you can see in Print Preview, there's a difference between printing a pivot chart on a worksheet and a pivot chart on its own chart sheet. In the first case, the chart prints at the same size at which it's displayed. On a chart sheet, the chart takes up the entire sheet and prints as a full page. Printing charts to paper produces copies you can include in annual reports, news releases, and correspondence. You can also choose to print to an Adobe Portable Document Format file or other electronic file format, which enables you to take a copy of the chart with you as you travel without taking the original workbook from which you printed it. When you work with pivot tables, you'll often find that you want to recreate a particular configuration. You could write down the fields and the order in which they appear, but it's far easier to record a macro that configures the pivot table for you. So I have a pivot table that contains sales data for firm A and firm B, and it's monthly for the years 2009 and 2010. And I also have the quarter field up here in the report filters area. And my goal is to recreate this configuration by using a macro. So the first thing we need to do is start recording the macro. To do that, we click the View tab on the ribbon, click the Macros buttons down arrow, and then click Record Macro. And I'll type in a macro name and I'll just call it First Position. And now I'll click OK, and Excel will start recording my actions. The first step to recording a pivot table macro in Excel is to clear the entire pivot table and recreate it from scratch. So in this case, With a cell in the pivot table selected, click the Options tab, click Clear, and then click Clear All. Now I can recreate the pivot table from the start. So I will add the year field to the row labels area, month below that, company in the column labels area, quarter in the report filter area, and then revenue in the values area. And I have the same configuration that I had when I started. Now to stop recording, click the View tab on the ribbon, click the Macros buttons down arrow, and click Stop Recording. So now we have a macro that will recreate this pivot table position. If you want to view the macro, you can do so by opening it in the Visual Basic Editor. So to do that, from the View tab of the ribbon, click the Macros buttons down arrow, click View Macros, and then in the macro dialog box, make sure that the macro you want to see is displayed and highlighted, and then click Edit. When you do, the macro opens inside of the Visual Basic Editor. So I'll double-click to maximize this window within the Visual Basic Editor. So as you can see, there is a lot going on when you create a pivot table. This first line, range B6 select, isn't actually necessary. It's just that I clicked another cell inside the pivot table to ensure it was active. It won't hurt the running at all. And then secondly, you can see all of the actions that I took with regards to the pivot table. So first I cleared the table, and then I added the field year to the row field area in position 1, the field month to the row field area in position 2. Then I added company to the column field in position 1, and then quarter in the page field area in position 1, and then the revenue field in the revenue area. And it uses the sum summary operation. So there's a lot going on with pivot tables, and anytime that you want to work with pivot tables and use macros, you should never try to create these things by hand. There's just too much going on and it'll take you too long, and it's way too likely that you'll make a mistake. Always record your macro. What I can do, now that I've recorded the macro, is go back into Excel, and to do that, just go up to the File menu and click Close and return to Microsoft Excel. And then, because there is a macro inside of this file, we need to save it as a macro-enabled file. To do that, click File, and then Save As. And then we can keep the same record macro name, but we need to change the type. So click the Save as Type button, and then from the list that appears, click Excel Macro Enabled Workbook, and then click Save. Now your macro will be ready whenever you want it. The macro recording skills I've taught you in this movie apply to any Excel operation, not just pivot tables. But because pivot table macros are extremely complicated, it's easiest to record and use them instead of writing them from scratch. Excel macros let you perform complicated tasks such as manipulating pivot tables quickly by recording the steps and playing them back when needed. In this movie, I'll show you several ways to run your macros so you can pick the one that works best for you. I've started with just a blank workbook open, and the reason for that is that I want to show you what can happen if you open a workbook that contains a macro. To do that, I will press Ctrl-O to display the open dialog box, and then I'll navigate to my exercise files folder, which is on my desktop, and then under Chapter 8, I'll double-click Running, which is the sample file we'll use for this movie. When I double-click the file to open it, you might see a security warning bar indicating that macros have been disabled. You then have two options, either to enable the content or to click the Close button to close the message bar without enabling macros. In this example, I do want to use the macros, so in a moment we'll click the Enable Content button. But before that, if you don't see this bar, I want to tell you how you can enable macros from within the Trust Center dialog box. Because what probably happened, if you didn't see the security warning bar come up, it means that macros have been turned off entirely for this installation of Microsoft Excel. And if that's the case and you want to run macros, here's what you do. You click the File tab to go to the Backstage view, and then click Options. Then in the Excel Options dialog box, click Trust Center, and then click Trust Center Settings. In the Trust Center dialog box, click Macro Settings. And here you can select what you want to do with your macros. At present, I have my macro security setting at Disable All Macros with Notification. As we saw earlier, that gives me the option to allow macros to run. If you didn't see the security warning bar and you're having trouble running macros, then your macro security might be set to disable all macros without notification, or disable all macros except digitally signed macros. So if you didn't see a message bar, then you need to come into this dialog box and set your security to disable all macros with notification. If you're in a corporate or enterprise environment, then please make sure that making that change is okay with your IT department. Let them know that you're working through this course and that the workbook contains macros and is known to contain macros. If they're okay with it, or if they'll do it for you, go ahead and change your macro security setting. So I have mine where I need it, so I'll click Cancel twice to close out of the Excel Options dialog box, and I can click the Enable Content button to enable macros. Now, there are several ways to run a macro in Microsoft Excel. The first is from within the Macros dialog box. To view the Macros dialog box, click the View tab, and then at the far right end, you'll see the Macros button. Click the down arrow, and then click View Macros. When you do, you see the macros that are available inside of your workbook. If you want to run a macro, then just click the name, and then click Run. The macro that I just created rearranged the contents of this pivot table. Another way to run a macro is to assign it to a shape. So let me go to the Insert tab, click Shapes, and then I'll just create a rounded rectangle, and I'll make a small button here, and then I'll type some text to put in the middle, Macro Launch, and then right-click the shape and click Assign Macro. This displays the Assign Macro dialog box, and you can select any of the macros that you want. In this case, I want to do company by quarter and year, and then click OK. Now, if I click away from the button to release the selection and move my mouse pointer over the button, you'll see that the mouse pointer changes to a pointing hand. It's the same pointing hand you might see if you hover your mouse pointer over a hyperlink, such as one that leads to a web page. That's because clicking this button or a hyperlink will lead to an action. So the pointing hand means that something is about to happen, whether it's going to another web page or running a macro. In this case, if I click the button, Excel runs the macro that I assigned to it. Now, the final way that I'm going to show you to run a macro is by creating a button for it on the Quick Access toolbar. To do that, click the Customize Quick Access toolbar down arrow, then click More Commands. Then on the Quick Access toolbar page of the Excel Options dialog box, in the Choose Commands From list, click its down arrow, and then click Macros. Doing so will list the macros that are available to you in this workbook. In this case, I want to do Year, Month, Company. So I'll click it and click Add. And then after you add the button, you can change its appearance. Make sure that the macro is selected over on the Quick Access toolbar side of the pane. Click Modify, and then select the button that you want. In this case, I will apply a play button. Everything looks good, and I will leave the display name the same, and click OK. Now when I click OK, Excel adds the button to the Quick Access toolbar. When I click it, Excel runs the macro. If you run a macro occasionally, or you don't want your colleagues running it out of curiosity, you might find the best solution for your application is to run the macro from the macro dialog box. If you build a worksheet that relies on a macro to update the values, or to write values to another worksheet, then attaching the macro to a shape might be best. If you run several macros frequently, then adding them to the Quick Access toolbar makes them available without cluttering your display. Pivot tables make it easy to emphasize aspects of your data, whether that's monthly performance or sales to a customer. The problem with pivot tables is that it can be hard to remember how to reconstruct a position during a presentation. Having detailed notes helps, but you still have to take the time to manipulate your worksheet. In this movie, I will show you how to create a simple Excel presentation kit that uses macros to recall positions. I've decided to run my macros by clicking shapes that I have positioned in row 1, but you can just as easily add macro buttons to the Quick Access toolbar. I've already recorded and assigned macros for the year, month, and quarter company shapes. So now what I want to do is record a macro for the company by month and year shape, and then assign it. To record that macro, I'll go to the View tab, and then at the right end, click the Macros buttons down arrow, and then click Record Macro. Then in the Record Macro dialog box, I can type in a macro name, and in this case, I'll make it exactly the same as what appears in the shape. So CUMP_MNTH_year, YEAR. Now I can click OK and start recording. My first step will be to clear everything from the body of the pivot table. So click Options, and the Options contextual tab appears because a cell within the pivot table is currently selected. Then click Clear and clear all. Now if the pivot table back to 0, I can create the position I want. And in this case, that will be company. Then month below that in the row labels area. Then year in the column labels area. And revenue in the values area. That's the position I want. So I can stop recording, and to do that, click the View tab. Click the Macros buttons down arrow, then click Stop Recording. Now I can attach the macro to the shape. So I'll right-click the shape I want, click Assign Macro, and then click the macro name that I want to apply, and that's the top one, Company by Month and Year. And when I click OK, the shape is assigned to the macro. Now when I'm giving my presentation and I want to recall a particular pivot table position, I can just click the shape that it applies to. So for example, if I want to display the year by month position, I can just click that shape and it appears quarter company, there it is, and company by month and year. And also there's nothing about this position that's magical. In other words, I can manipulate the pivot table and then click any of the macros, and because I have Excel clear the pivot table first, then it will recreate the position exactly. So let's say that I create a filter on the month column that displays only months that contain the letters JU. So I'll type in JU, and I see June and July, those are the only 2 months, and I'll click OK. Now if I were to click the year month shape to run that macro, Excel clears the pivot table and then recreates the position that I wanted. Recording your pivot table positions as macros makes it much easier for you to display the data you want. Rather than worry about how to recreate a position, you can focus on your message. If you've ever tried to create a pivot table from a file containing hundreds of thousands of rows of data, you might have noticed some performance issues. Power Pivot, a new technology introduced alongside Excel 2010, uses advanced data handling techniques to let you manipulate large data sets more efficiently. In this movie, I'll give you an overview of how to analyze data in Power Pivot, and then later in this chapter, we'll dive into specifics of bringing data into Power Pivot. So this is what a Power Pivot datasheet looks like. I have several different columns of data, as you can see at the bottom left-hand corner. This Power Pivot dataset contains over 964,000 rows. Now normally in Excel that would take a lot of time to work with, but let's say that I want to filter it so that I only show orders of quantity 14. So I can click the filter arrow and create my filter. Click OK. And Excel filters the rows, and you can see we're down to just under 50,000. Creating another filter, say for store number 1, limits the data even further. Now we're down under 500. And then I'll just clear the filters. As you can see, working with large data sets within Power Pivot happens much more quickly than it would if you were just using a regular pivot table and an Excel worksheet. So now let's create a pivot table off of this data. And I'll just create it here in my workbook. And then just as filtering that data happens much more quickly in Power Pivot than it would in Excel, I can create a pivot table even with this massive data set much more quickly within Power Pivot. So I'll just put my store ID, row labels, the year on the column labels, and total order in the values area. And there's my data. Again, over 960,000 rows summarized just that quickly. The technology behind Power Pivot lets you manage large datasets much more efficiently than is possible using conventional pivot tables. In the next couple of movies, I'll show you how to install Power Pivot, bring your data in, and then work with it. When you're ready to start using Microsoft Power Pivot for Excel, you can download it from the website powerpivot.com. Once you're on that site, click the download link, and then follow the download instructions. I won't read the prerequisites, or registered to download the trial because I already have Office 2010 installed. So I will go down to what is currently the third link and click the See Details item next to Download Power Pivot for Excel 2010. In this case, we are using the 32-bit version of Excel 2010, so we'll use that version of Power Pivot. And I'll click the Power Pivot link, and we go to the Microsoft Download Center. And if I scroll down using my mouse's scroll wheel, I can select the version I want to download, which is the x86 version, and then I'll click the Download button. I'm asked if I want to save the file or run it. In this case, I will just save it, and I'll save it to my Downloads folder and click Save. Once the download's complete, you can close the folder and then close out of your web browser. And now I will open my Downloads folder and double-click Power Pivot for Excel x86. I'll verify that I do want to run the file and step through the Excel Power Pivot Setup wizard. So I'll click Next to go past the first screen. I'll accept the terms of the license agreement, click Next. And I'll just type in a company, lynda.com, click Next, and then click Install. And now that it's done, I can click Finish. And I'll close my Windows Explorer window and run Excel. As Excel starts, you'll see that it has loaded the Power Pivot add-in. And then when you run the program for the first time after you install Power Pivot, a warning box appears indicating that it has installed a customization and asking you if you want to keep it. You can either select not to install it if you don't recognize the publisher, or you can choose to keep the installation by clicking the Install button. So in this case, we are familiar with the program and we did want to install it, so we can click Install. When we do, Excel installs Power Pivot, and the Power Pivot tab appears on the ribbon. And we'll just click it to make sure all the tools are there and everything looks to be in order. Now the Power Pivot's installed, we can start downloading data and working with it quickly and efficiently. Power Pivot helps you analyze large data sets efficiently, but you do have to import data into Power Pivot to get started. In this movie, I'll show you how to bring data from an Excel workbook into Power Pivot. First thing you do is click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and then in the Launch group, click the Power Pivot window button. Then inside of Power Pivot, on the Home tab, click the control that will let you get the data from the type of source that you want. And you have many different sources available. For example, you can get your data from a database, SQL Server Access, Analysis Services, or even another Power Pivot workbook. You can also get your data from a report, and that would be something like a Microsoft SQL Server Reporting Services report. You can also download data from the Azure Data Market, from RSS data feeds, from text files, or in this case, we're going to use other text sources, because at the bottom of this list, you will find Microsoft Excel, and that is the type of file that we want to bring our data in from. So I will select Excel file and click Next. Now I can indicate the file that I want to use, and I know that the file I want has the first row as column headers. So I will check that box, and now I can click the Browse button and use it to find the file that I want. In this case, the file that I want is called Wholesale Data, so I'll click it and click Open. Everything looks good, so I can click Next to move to the next page of the wizard. And when I do, Excel looks inside the file to see if there are any tables that it can use. The second table is called Data. That is the one that I want, and to make sure, I'll click Preview and Filter. That way I get a short preview of the data that's in that file, and it'll take just a moment to come up. After the data comes up, you can preview to make sure everything looks right, and in this case, I have Order ID, Store ID, and all the data I expect. So that looks good. I can click OK. And then within the wizard, I can click Finish to import the data into Power Pivot. There are over 900,000 rows of data in this file, so it may take a while to import, but to get started, I will click Finish. After I do, Power Pivot indicates that the import is in progress, and in a moment or two, we should see that it has imported about 100,000 rows, then 200, then 300,000, and so on. So now we're starting to get in our data. Looks like we're a little bit more than halfway through, and coming up on 900,000, almost there. And I should point out that at any time during the transfer, I could have clicked the Stop Import button to stop the import from occurring. But now we were successful, 964,260 rows were transferred into Power Pivot. So I can click Close, and the data appears within Power Pivot. Now I want to save this data model, so I'll click the Save button. After I click Save, the Power Pivot window disappears. In this movie, I showed you how to bring Excel data into Power Pivot, but the steps are almost exactly the same for most other data sources. Just select the type of source you want and go through the steps to bring it in for analysis. After you bring your data into Power Pivot, you can manage the data within both the Power Pivot datasheet and also within your pivot tables. In this movie, I will show you how to work with Power Pivot columns of data. So to display the data that I have in this worksheet, I will click the Power Pivot tab and then open the Power Pivot window by clicking the Power Pivot window button in the Launch section of this tab on the ribbon. And when I do, my data appears in Power Pivot, and to indicate how much data we're working with at the bottom left corner, you can see that we're currently looking at row 1 of 964,260. In Power Pivot, as in Excel, you can manipulate the columns inside of the Power Pivot window. So let's say, for example, that you want to hide a particular column, and in this case, we'll just say that we want to hide the product column. To do that, you can right-click the column header, and then click Hide Columns, and then select whether you want to hide the column from the Power Pivot window and the pivot table, just from the pivot tables, or just from Power Pivot. In this case, I just want to hide it from Power Pivot, but I want to leave the column available for my pivot tables. So then I will click From Power Pivot. When I do, the column disappears. Now the data hasn't been deleted, it's still there. It's just that I don't have to see it within the Power Pivot window. If I want to bring it back, I can right-click any column header, click Unhide Columns to display the Hide and Unhide Columns dialog box, and then scroll down, and I see that the product table isn't checked in the In Power Pivot window column, so I can check the box to bring it back and click OK. If you want to display the Hide and Unhide Columns dialog box and manipulate columns more than one at a time, you can click the Design tab, click the Hide and Unhide button, and the dialog box appears. If you do want to delete a column from the Power Pivot model permanently, then you right-click the column header in the Power Pivot datasheet, and then click Delete Column. So I won't go all the way through with this, but let's say that I wanted to delete the total column. To do that, I would right-click the column header, and then click Delete Columns. And then, after Power Pivot asked if I were serious about deleting that column, I would say yes. But in this case, I don't want to get rid of it. So I'll just click away from the shortcut list to remove the selection. If you remove a column from the data model, it is permanent. You would have to create a new data model to bring the data back, but the data still exists in the source table. One other way that you can manipulate columns inside of the Power Pivot window is to freeze columns at the left side of the worksheet. So let's say that I go back to the Home tab, and I will resize the Power Pivot window just so we don't see the right edge. So you can see what happens when we scroll. And now I will click any cell in the first column, that's the Order ID column. Then I'll click the Freeze buttons down arrow on the Home tab of the Power Pivot window, and then click Freeze. When I do, you see this thin black line appear. That's because the Order ID column is now frozen to the left side, and it won't disappear when I scroll past. So if I scroll to the right to display the hidden rows at the right edge of the sheet, then you see that the Order ID column stays regardless of how far to the right I scroll. Now, if I click the Freeze buttons down arrow again and click Unfreeze, then Excel removes the selection. You won't need to use every column of data you bring into Power Pivot, so you can either delete the columns you don't want, or, if you think they might be useful in the future, hide them from the datasheet or the pivot table. Any of these actions reduces crowding within Power Pivot, making it easier to understand your data at a glance. Power Pivot lets you manipulate large data sets efficiently, but you should only import the tables you need. Importing unnecessary data can slow performance and make it harder for you to find the data you want. If you discover that you didn't import a table you actually need, you can add that table to your data model in a few steps. So to start out, I'll open Power Pivot And to do that, I'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon and then click the Power Pivot window button. Now to bring my new data into Power Pivot, I will need to import it, and in this case, the data that I want to bring in is in an Access database. So I will click the From Database button on the Home tab of the Power Pivot window, and then click From Access. The Table Import Wizard dialog box appears, and I can click Browse, and then the data that I want is in the Month Table database, so I'll double-click it, and when I do, the database name and full path appear in the database name field. If this database were password protected, then I could type in my username and password and also save my password by checking this box if I wanted to. In this case, the database is not password protected, so I can just click Next. Now I can either select from a list of tables and views, or I can write a query. Writing a query is beyond the scope of this course, so I will leave the Select from a list of tables and views option selected and click Next. And then I get a list of tables and views. And in this case, the only table in the database is one called Months. That is the one I want, so I can make sure that it is selected and click Finish. There are only 12 rows of data in this table, so the import happens very quickly. Now that it's done, I can click Close. After I close the wizard, Power Pivot displays the table in Datasheet view, and you can see the two columns Month ID and Month Name. Also, as in an Excel workbook, you can see here at the bottom left corner of the program window that we have two tabs, the Months tab and the Data tab. Clicking the tabs moves between them so that you can see your data and work with them as desired. So don't worry if you overlooked a table you wanted to import. Just reopen the data source by using the controls in the Get External Data group and bring the table in when you want to add it. In the next movie, I'll show you how to create a relationship between these two tables. When you work with large data collections, especially those stored in relational databases such as Access or SQL Server, it's likely that your data will be spread among several tables. For example, you could have a table of sales data that lists each month by its number, January's 1, February's 2, and so on. If you have the month's number in one table and a list of which month corresponds to which number in another, you can often create a relationship between those two tables, and in this case, use the month's name instead of its number. As an example, let's take a look at the data model within this Power Pivot file. So to do that, I'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon and click the Power Pivot window button to display Power Pivot. When I do, the Power Pivot for Excel window opens, and I have two different tables in this data model. I have months and I have data. Let's take a look at the months table first. In this case, I have 12 rows, and those are the month names in English with the corresponding month ID number. January is 1, February is 2, and so on. In this table, the month ID field contains a unique value in each row, and it distinguishes that row from all other rows in the table. That means that it can be called a key field because you can use it to identify a single row within the data collection. Now let's take a look at the same data over in the data table. In this table, we have the order month field, and as you can see, not every row contains a unique value. Some orders are from January, which is month 1, others from February, month 2, and so on. However, we do know from the way that the calendar is composed that the values in the order month field will always be the numbers 1 through 12, and that means we can create a correspondence or a relationship between the column order month in this table and the column month ID in the other table. In other words, we can create a relationship. To do that, on the Design tab in the Power Pivot window, we click the Create Relationship button. Then in the Create Relationship dialog box, we can select the table and the columns to identify the two fields that contain the same data. So in this case, the data table contains the order month field, and then the related lookup table is in the months table, and the related lookup column is the month ID. So again, just dropping this down a little bit so we can see the numbers in the order month column. The order month column contains the numbers 1 through 12 corresponding to the month in which the order was placed. In the months table, the month ID field contains the numbers 1 through 12, and those correspond to the months January, February, March, and so on. So with this relationship defined, we can click Create, and Power Pivot creates a relationship between those two tables. So how does this affect us? Well, what it allows us to do is to create a pivot table, and instead of displaying month numbers, we can display the month names by using the relationship. So to do that, we click the Home tab on the ribbon and then click the Pivot Table button. That puts us back into Excel, and we can create the pivot table on a new worksheet and click OK. So now we have a new worksheet with a pivot table, and I'll just create a very simple pivot table based on this data. I will have the store ID in the row labels area, and then the order month below it. And yes, this will show a number. I'm going to change that in a bit. I just wanted you to see what it would look like before we use the related table. So we have store ID, order month, and then I can put total in the values area. So now let's see what happens when I use the month name field from the months table. So I will remove order month from the row labels area, and now I will click the expand button next to the months table and then drag month name to below store ID on the row labels area. When I do, the month names appear in the pivot table, but they're sorted into alphabetical order. However, if I click one of the cells that contain a month name, and then on the Home tab, click the Sort and Filter button and click Sort A to Z, Excel knows to sort them into proper month order because it recognizes the series. Creating a relationship between two tables lets you expand the types of data you can include in your pivot table. In this example, we used the relationship between the data and months tables to change a month's number to its name, which made the summary easier to understand. When you create a Power Pivot data model, you can sort, filter, and create a pivot table to summarize your data. You can also create your own summaries using data analysis expressions, or DAX. DAX expressions are similar to Excel worksheet formulas you use to summarize values in Excel tables. So just for a quick comparison, if I wanted to find the 2008 sales in the table to the left, I would type equal, sum, left parentheses, and then we're looking at the values in D3 through D8. So type a right parentheses and press enter, and there's the formula for just those cells. If I wanted to find the total of all sales in the sales column of the table, then I would type equal, sum, left parentheses, and then the name of the table, which is table 1. So TABLE1, and then a left square bracket so that I can start naming the column I want to use. And in this case, that is sales. So I'll type in S. And then in the formula autocomplete list, I see that sales is highlighted. So I can press tab to accept it. Type a right square bracket to close the table column reference, and then a right parentheses to close the sum formula. Press enter, and I get my result. And if I highlight that cell again, I can see that I have the table reference followed by the column reference, all as an argument inside of the sum formula. Now let's shift over to Power Pivot and create a calculated column so that you can see how it compares. So I'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon and then click the Power Pivot window button. And here I have my Power Pivot data model. What I want to do is create a new column that finds the total for each line item. So I will be multiplying quantity by price. So I will click in the first cell in the Add Column column, and then type equal. You'll see the typing here in the formula bar as opposed to in the cell. So type equal and then a left square bracket. And then I can use the down arrow key to select the first field I want, and that's quantity. Press tab, and then in Power Pivot, the program encloses the field name in square brackets, so you don't need to type it in yourself. Now type in asterisk for multiply, then a left square bracket, and we're multiplying by price, so I'll type a P, and the highlighted item is price, so I'll press tab. Everything looks good, and when I press enter, you'll see the Power Pivot creates a calculated column called Calculated Column 1, and its values are the quantity times the price. DAX lets you extend the basic capabilities of Power Pivot by creating expressions that summarize your data. In the rest of this chapter, I'll go into more detail on how to use DAX to summarize your data. Like Excel, The DAX language uses operators to summarize and compare values. You'll probably recognize the arithmetic operators from your regular Excel formulas, but some of the other operators might require some explanation. In this movie, I'll start out with an overview of the operators you can use, and then show you some examples of expressions with a few of them. DAX operators are divided into several different groups. The first is the arithmetic, and it's almost certainly familiar to you. You have the plus sign for addition, minus for subtraction, or to indicate a negative number, the asterisk for multiplication, and the / for division. Then there are the comparison operators, and you probably would have used these if you created a filter or a conditional format inside of Excel. Equal tests for equal to, then there's not equal to, greater than, and so on. Then the last two groups are the text and logical groups. So for text, you have the ampersand, which you can use to concatenate two strings, and you can use that in Excel as well. The last group is the logical group, and those allow you to test for conditions. So for example, you have two ampersands back to back. That is the AND condition, which returns a value of true if both conditions are true. So for example, if you are looking at a value, then you want to test if the sale was from 2008 and the month of January. Then you could use the double ampersand operator to create an AND condition. Two vertical bars create an OR condition, and it is an inclusive OR, which means that either one of the expressions or both may be true for the OR expression to return true. And then finally, you have the exclamation point, which is the NOT operator. The NOT operator checks to see whether something is not true. In other words, if you were looking for sales that were not in 2008, you could type an exclamation point and then 2008. Now I'll switch back to my DAX operators workbook and launch the Power Pivot module so you can see me working with these operators in a few formula. Now that I'm back in the workbook, I'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon and then Power Pivot window to launch Power Pivot. Now we'll create a few examples. So for example, I will create a formula in the Add Column area, type an equal sign, and in this case, I'll do a multiplication of multiplying quantity by price. So I'll type a left square bracket, then a Q, and then press Tab to accept the quantity field, then an asterisk to multiply, left square bracket, and we'll multiply by price, and that is the highlighted field, so I'll press Tab and then press Enter. Now let's say that I want to use concatenation to create a statement of the form that store blank ordered a quantity of bottles. So I'll be using store ID, and quantity. To do that, I will scroll over to the right, and then in the new Add Column, type an equal sign, and then I'll create the following formula in the formula bar. Double quote, store, S-T-O-R-E, and then a space, followed by another double quote, space, ampersand, space, then a left square bracket, and ST, which gives me store ID. So I will press Tab to accept that field. Then an ampersand, space, double quote, space ordered, O-R-D-E-R-E-D, space, double quote, space, ampersand, and then a left square bracket after a space. Then we have quantity, so I'll type a Q, and then Tab to accept the quantity field, a space, ampersand, space, double quote, space, bottles, period, and then a double quote. So my goal was to have the literal text string of store, followed by a space, then the store ID, followed by a space, then the word ordered, then a space, then the quantity ordered, then a space, and then the word bottles with a period. So hopefully if I've created my formula correctly and I press enter, that is what will appear in the new column. So I'll just adjust the width of the column, and we can see that I created the expression correctly. With these examples in mind, I think you'll have a good idea of how to use DAX operators in your Power Pivot expressions. Feel free to play around, but always do so in a backup copy of your data. When you want to summarize your Power Pivot data, you can use the built-in DAX functions to do so. There are two ways to find the functions you need. The first is to use the help system to look up the function you want, and the second is to start typing the function's name and select the proper function from the IntelliSense list that appears. You're probably familiar with Formula Autocomplete and IntelliSense from using Excel. So I'll show you how to use the Power Pivot help system to get information on the available functions. To begin, in Excel, we'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and then click the Power Pivot window button. And when we do, our data model appears inside of the Power Pivot window. Now to get help in Power Pivot, you can click the Help button, and it's the blue button with the question mark at the top right corner of the ribbon. So click that, and the SQL Server PowerPoint from Microsoft Excel Help dialog box appears. Then inside the dialog box, click the Search tab in the left-hand pane, and then type function reference. FUNCTION space REFERENCE, and then press enter. When you do, you see a list of topics, and in my topic list, topic number 14 is the function reference. I've highlighted it to make it call out, and I'll double click it to make it appear in the right-hand pane of the dialog box. I'll expand the window so that it's much wider, and now within the window, I can click the DAX Online Function Reference link. When I do, that displays the function reference page on Microsoft TechNet, and I'll drag the left-hand side of this window to make it even larger. And now, within the reference article, you can go to any different section that you want. So let's say, for example, that you wanted to get information about statistical functions. To do that, you can click the Statistical Functions link, and you'll see all the functions that are listed and that you can use here in the article. If you want to go back to the previous page, you can click the Back button on the toolbar, and it'll take you back to the main page. And just to see one other section, we'll click the Date and Time Functions link. And on that page, we get a list of the functions that are available to us. The DAX language doesn't include all of the functions you'll find in Excel, but it does offer a wide variety of functions that let you build calculations to summarize your data effectively. I strongly encourage you to read through the DAX function reference to become familiar with the functions at your disposal. After you import data into Excel, you might find you want to summarize your data in a way that's not included in the original table. For example, your table might include a price column and a quantity column, but not a column that multiplies those values together to find the total for each row. If you do want to multiply those values together, you can create what's called a calculated column. You can also summarize your data using a measure, which you can use within a pivot table. In this movie, I'll show you how to create both calculated columns and measures. To begin, I'll jump into Power Pivot, so I'll click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and then the Power Pivot window button to display my data within Power Pivot. And now to create a calculated column, I click over in the Add column, and then I can start typing my formula. In this case, I'll type an equal sign, and you can see the formula here on the formula bar. And then I'll type the names of the fields that I want in my calculation. So in this case, I want the price. So I'll type a left square bracket, and then a P. The price field's name is highlighted in blue, so I'll press Tab to accept it. Then type an asterisk, and then a left square bracket. And then I want the quantity field. So I'll type Q, press Tab to accept the quantity, and press Enter. When I do, Power Pivot adds a calculated column to my table. I can rename that column by double-clicking the column name, and then when it's highlighted in blue, typing a new name, and in this case, I will call it Total Order, and press Enter. One thing to note is that calculated columns summarize data at the row level within your Power Pivot data. So as you can see from the formula, I'm multiplying the price column's value by the quantity column's value for each row to derive a new value. If you want to summarize your data at a higher level, you can create what's called a measure, and you create measures within pivot tables. So on the Home tab of the Power Pivot Windows ribbon, I'll click the Pivot Table button, and then select New Worksheet in the Create Pivot Table dialog box, and then click OK. Now I'm back in Excel in a worksheet, and I can use the controls on the Power Pivot tab of the ribbon to create my measure. So I'll go over here in the Measures group and click the New Measure button. And now I can create my measure. The table name is data. That's the table from the Power Pivot data model. And now I can type in the name for this measure, and I'll make it average sale. So AVERAGE, capital SALE. And now down in the formula box, I can create the formula. And in this case, the formula will be average, left parentheses, and then the name of the column. And that column is from the data table, left square bracket, and total order. That's the calculated column that I just created. So I'll highlight it in the list, press the tab key to accept it, type a right parentheses, everything looks good, and now I can click OK. And when I do, Power Pivot creates a pivot table with the average sale field in the values area. And then within the body of the pivot table, you can see that the average sale value for all sales was a bit over $131.4. Now let's start adding some divisions into the pivot table. So let's say that I only care about years. So I will drag the order year field down to the row labels area. And you can see that the average sale for 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010 appear inside of the pivot table. Creating a calculated column doesn't add a column to your original data source, but it does let you summarize your data using calculations you might not have in the original table. Calculated columns generate their values on a row-by-row basis, but a measure summarizes all of the data referred to in a pivot table cell. That value could be from a single table row, but more than likely it summarizes part of your data. In that case, you have to use a measure instead of a calculated column. When you create measures in Power Pivot, you can run into unexpected problems when you use functions such as sum or count. In this movie, I'll show you how to avoid those issues by using aggregate functions such as SUMX and COUNTX. So to begin, let's go into Power Pivot, click the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and then the Power Pivot window button, and our data reappears inside of Power Pivot. Now in the previous movie, I showed you how to create a calculated column and a measure. The difference between the two is that a calculated column uses values within a table row to generate its result, while a measure summarizes the values for an entire column. This data model has two columns, price and quantity, that I can use to calculate a total. I can if I want to create the calculated column, such as by adding a formula equal, and I'm just repeating what I did from the previous movie, left square bracket, price, multiplied by, again, left square bracket and a Q for quantity, press tab to accept it, and press enter. So there is my calculated column, and I won't bother renaming it this time. Now, if I want to create a measure from those two columns, I need to create a pivot table and then create the measure. So to do that, I click the pivot table button and put it on new worksheet, click OK, and I get my new pivot table. Now let's say that I want to create a new measure called order total. To do that, I click the new measure button, and then I'll change the name of the measure to order total. And you don't have to start with a capital letter, I just do it out of convention. And then we can create the formula. So I'll click in the formula box, and this formula will generate an error. So it's equal sum, left parentheses data, left square bracket price. So I'll start with a P and select that total, type in asterisk, and then type in data, and a left square bracket, and then Q for quantity. Press tab to accept the field, right parentheses to close the formula, and click OK. Now you can see when I did that I got an error. In other words, it says the calculation has been aborted, and the error message says that the sum function only accepts a column reference as an argument. So that means that I need to go in and to change the formula. So I will right-click the order total field name here in the field list and click Edit Formula. So the formula that I'm going to create is called an aggregate formula. And the syntax is the function name followed by an X, then the table name, and then the expression. So in this case, the formula that I want to create is equal sum X, left parentheses, and then data, which is the name of the table, then a comma. Then I can create the expression, and the expression will be what I created before. So the data table, left parentheses, and then price, typing a P, and then pressing tab to accept it, then an asterisk, and then now we want the quantity column from the data table. So that would be data, left a square bracket, and then a Q for quantity, and then press tab to accept it, and then a right parentheses to close the formula. Now when I click OK, Excel finds the value and the formula operates normally. So once again, let's go back into the measure. So with the measure selected, you can click Measure Settings to display the Measure Settings dialog box. And the formula reads SUMX, and then the name of the table, and then the expression that uses values from within that table. I don't want to make any changes, so I'll click Cancel. In addition to the SUMX formula, you can create CountX, CountAX, AverageX, MaxX, and MinX functions, which correspond to the count, CountA, average, max, and min worksheet functions. Aggregate functions let you summarize data by creating measures using values from multiple columns within a data model. If you can't get the calculation you want by using a regular function such as sum, consider using its aggregate counterpart. When you create a measure using an aggregate function, Power Pivot calculates that measure's value for every row summarized in the pivot table field. You can filter your pivot table to limit your data, but if you find yourself creating the same filter many times, you should consider creating a measure that incorporates that filter into its formula. In this movie, I'll show you how to do exactly that. So we'll jump into Power Pivot, clicking the Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and the Power Pivot window button. And we will create a measure that includes the filtered formula. So to do that, we'll click the Pivot Table button to create a pivot table, and we'll put it on a new worksheet in Excel, and click OK. Now remember that we need to use an aggregate function such as SUMX for the filter to work. So I'll create a new measure, and I'll name it Larger Orders, LARGER, and then capital ORDERS. And I'll go down to the formula box. In an aggregate function, you have the name of the function, followed by the table, and then the expression. And the table argument can be a real table, or it can be a virtual table that's created using another function. And in Power Pivot, you can use the filter function to create a virtual table that's a subset of the original table. To give you an example, I'll create the formula equal SUMX, left parentheses, and then a filter, FILTER, left parentheses, and now the filter function takes two arguments, the table that you're referring to, and then the actual filter. In this case, the table's name is data. Type a comma, and now I create a rule that does the filtering. And in this case, I only want to see orders with quantities greater than 18, so in other words, 19 or more items. So for that, I'll type in data, left square bracket, and then we're referring to the quantity field, so I'll type a Q, then a tab to accept that field, then a greater than sign, and then the number 18. Now I type a right parentheses to close the filter function, and now I'm back in the SUMX function. Now I'll type a comma, and now I can type the expression. So first we'll have the data quantity field, so DATA, left square bracket, Q for quantity, press tab, and I'm going to multiply that by the price field. So type an asterisk, and then data, left square bracket, and P for price. It's the highlighted item, so I can press tab to accept it, then a right parentheses, and the formula looks good, so I can click OK. So you can see from the body of the pivot table that the total of my larger orders appears in cell B4. Now let's compare that to the total of all orders. So to do that, I will drag the order total field to the values area, and you can see that the order total is greater than larger orders. The opposite function of the filter function is called all, and that ignores any filters in the data model or in the pivot table. To illustrate that, I'll create another new measure, and I will name this one All Store Sales. Then in the formula box, I'll create the formula SUMX. Again, we need to use an aggregate function, left parentheses, the keyword all, then a left parentheses, and then I want every row in the data table, so I'll type data, right parentheses, a comma, and now I can type my expression which will be, once again, the price field times the quantity field. So data, left square bracket, quantity, type Q, and then tab to accept the highlighted field, asterisk, and then data, left square bracket, P for price, it's highlighted, press tab to accept it, then a right parentheses, and click OK. When I do, Excel adds that field to the data area of the pivot table. Now let's see what happens when I create a report filter based on the store ID field. So I'll drag the store ID field down to the report filter area, and then I'll go up and click the filter arrow. Click the expand control next to all, and then I'll check the select multiple items box, clear the checkbox next to all, and then we'll just look at the values for store 1. So I'll click OK, and Excel filters the pivot table. So you'll notice that the larger orders field changed its value, the sum of order total field changed its value, but the all store sales field did not change its value, and that's because the measure used to produce its value ignores any filters applied to the table. Building a filter into an aggregate function saves you time when you summarize data in Power Pivot. Be sure to name any filtered measures clearly to ensure your pivot table summarizes exactly the data you want it to. Alternatively, if you always want a measure to display the total of every row in the data model, use the all function in your measures formula.